Irrevocably Gone, written and read by P.O. Dixon. Inspired by P.O. Dixon's best-selling short story, A Tender Moment. Chapter 1. Hertfordshire, November 1811. A frantic dash throughout the halls of Longbourn ended triumphantly when Mrs. Bennet found her husband in the library, with his head buried in one of the many books scattered about on his desk. If 23 years of marriage had taught her anything, she would have known he did not wish to be disturbed, especially at that particular moment. Alas, not being inclined to learn such lessons, the lady of the house approached him directly. Wringing her hands in her apron, one which she donned more for show than functionality, for she was not inclined to do such menial tasks as housework, she cried, "Oh, Mr. Bennet!" The gentleman did not bother to look up from his book. "Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him once again, this time with more urgency in her voice, "you must allow me to tell you what happened at Lucas Lodge last evening." His eyes trained on the page before him, he responded, "No doubt you wish to tell me which lady wore what and who shunned whom. Can it not wait a while longer?" A determined matriarch, whose business in life was marrying off her 5 daughters, she placed her hands on her hips in defiance. "It most certainly will not wait. As it pertains to Lizzie, the one daughter to whom you always given the preference, you will want to hear what I have to say just as eagerly as I wish to say it." Indeed, of Thomas Bennet's 5 daughters, all of them out in society and neither of them married, his second eldest, Elizabeth, was his favorite. There was a quickness about her that none of her sisters possessed. With no sons to divert him, much less inherit his estate, which was entailed to the male line, his second-born child was Mr. Bennet's greatest consolation. Known for his dry humor and sardonic wit, the gray-haired patriarch peered over his spectacles at his wife. "Lizzie, you say? I knew the mere mention of her name would command your attention." Mr. Bennet turned his book face down on the desk and leaned back in his chair. "Indeed, you have my undivided attention. Pray, do not keep me in suspense." "I have reason to hope that Lizzie has an admirer, and one who happens to be from a most unexpected quarter, I might add." "You speak as though such a prospect comes as a surprise to you." "Why, I am more than surprised. I declare I am completely flabbergasted, as you too will be when you learn the gentleman's identity." "Now that you have sufficiently prepared me to be amazed, I beg you to reveal this mysterious admirer's name." "It is that proud Mr. Darcy," Mrs. Bennet exclaimed with energy. Her husband scoffed. "Surely you are mistaken, for I know with certainty that Lizzie does not like the gentleman, owing to his insulting remark the evening of the marriage and assembly, words to the effect that she is not handsome enough to tempt him, if I recall correctly." "Indeed, you do recall correctly. Mr. Darcy said our Lizzie was tolerable, which explains why I find myself completely at odds over what to think or how to feel about this new development." "What evidence do you have to support your suspicions that the proud Mr. Darcy's opinion of my Lizzie has changed?" "Why, he danced with her for one, when he might have danced with any number of single ladies in the room, including his so-called intimate friend, Miss Caroline Bingley." Always fatigued by his wife's raptures, Mr. Bennet took a deep breath and blew it out just as quickly. Drawing himself up to his desk as though he meant to resume reading, he said, "Is this the sole basis for your theory?" "There is more. The two were seen speaking to each other on the balcony afterward. Mr. Darcy even raised our Lizzie's hand to his lips before parting." Mr. Bennet arched his bushy brow. "Then what you are saying is that Mr. Darcy is a true gentleman after all. Shall we have the banns read?" "I did not say he offered his hand in marriage, at least not yet, but I do believe such a prospect is not beyond the realm of possibility." "Ah, from dislike to like, from like to matrimony, so easily as that." The rapidity of the inner workings of the female mind never ceases to amaze me, especially when the future of a single gentleman of large fortune is at stake, he said in jest, barely able to mask his amused expression. "You may laugh at me all you like, but you will not dampen my spirits one bit. A mother knows these things after all. Mark my words. There will be not just one but 2 weddings at Netherfield in 3 months, or my name is not Mrs. Francine Bennet. You will pardon me, my dear, if I do not celebrate just yet, for I do not know precisely what your assertion portends. Either I will gain a son-in-law, or 2, or I will not have had the pleasure of calling you my wife for the past couple decades." A woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper, who fancied herself of being of a nervous constitution when she was discontented, she cried, "Oh, Mr. Bennet, how you enjoy vexing me, but it simply will not do, especially today." "Pray, what makes today different from any other day?" "Did I not tell you? Lizzie is expecting a gentleman caller today." Turning on her heel, she proceeded to quit the room. Reaching for the doorknob, she looked back and faced her husband. "It is Mr. Darcy." Chapter 2. A Convenient Excuse. When Jane strode into the bedroom she shared with her sister Elizabeth, a delightful smile spread across her angelic countenance. "Lizzie," she said, "I certainly did not expect to see you. It is early still. I have never known you to return from your morning walk so soon." Jane sat on the bed beside her sister and took Elizabeth's hand in hers. Could your shortened ramble have anything at all to do with the expected arrival of a certain distinguished gentleman? Although, I confess, I am not completely satisfied by your explanation for the sudden change in your opinion of Mr. Darcy. In truth, Elizabeth could scarcely comprehend it either. However, she could not be nearly so bothered to understand it all as was her sister. She rather supposed a tiny part of her thought somewhat fondly of the gentleman from the start. Their conversation on the terrace at Lucas Lodge the evening before had been so enlightening. Just the remembrance of the way she felt when he kissed her palm was enough to make her heart flutter hours later. Now he is coming to see me. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy was the last man in the world whom she could have expected to call on her at Longbourn. Just thinking all the harsh words that she had spoken against him to anyone who would listen to her complaints about her perceived deficits in his character gave her cause for regret. I complained to my friend Charlotte that Mr. Darcy is no doubt the most miserable man in all of Derbyshire. I disagreed wholeheartedly with Jane, who defended him, positing he was an honorable, respectable man who was merely shy. I agreed with Mamma in her adamant contention that Mr. Darcy is haughty and above his company. Oh, how earnestly did she then wish that her former opinions of the gentleman had been more reasonable, her expressions more moderate. It would have spared her the awkwardness she now felt. Pray, my mamma and my younger sisters Kitty and Lydia will say or do nothing that will give Mr. Darcy reason to suspect how unforgivingly I have spoken against him since his arrival in Hertfordshire. Turning to her sister, Elizabeth said, I dare not deny that I did not always think so favorably of Mr. Darcy as I do now, but in such a case as this, a good memory is unpardonable. She squeezed her sister's hand. Now, Jane, you are much too generous to disagree with me, and you must promise me that this is the last time either of us shall ever remember anything I might have felt in the past. Do I have your promise? Smiling contentedly, Jane nodded. I knew I could rely on you. That said, Mr. Darcy merely asked for permission to call on me. None of the particulars were established. Who is to say the gentleman did not awaken this morning, and upon realizing what he has done, change his mind entirely? He may very well be halfway to London as we speak. Not that I would fault him. While he had made it clear that he did not hold her in contempt, he had made no such claims about her mother and her younger sisters. She shuddered a little in remembrance of her family's behavior the evening before. Mary's insistence upon exhibiting her performance fodder for censure and derision. Added to that was the specter of Kitty and Lydia flaunting themselves in front of the officers in attendance. Finally, there was her mother's tacit encouragement of the girls' antics. I dare say no one can accuse Mr. Darcy of being inconstant, Jane said. He strikes me as someone who knows his own mind. If he said he will come, then he will come. Jane only saw the good in people, a trait that Elizabeth did not always deem admirable. But in this case, she wanted nothing more than to share in her sister's generosity of spirits. If indeed he does come, I must also prevail on you to help temper our mother's behavior. I also ask that you stay close to my side when Mr. Darcy arrives, Jane, unless of course he comes with Mr. Bingley, which he very well may. I doubt an armed militia could prevent Mr. Bingley from calling on you with such a convenient excuse as accompanying his friend. By that same logic, I suppose it is also possible that Caroline might call on Longbourn as well. She may very well consider it her duty, said Jane. It vexed Elizabeth exceedingly that her sister was utterly blind to Caroline Bingley's pernicious ways. She cried, Pray she does not come. I know how much you like her, Jane, but I shall never share your good opinion of either Caroline or her sister, Louisa Hurst. Indeed, I would rather Mr. Darcy break his promise to me, if his being here means I am to be subjected to Caroline's company. Chapter 3. This Tender Regard. Darcy entered the paddock alone. He had not waited for his friend Bingley to accompany him on his morning call to the Bennets, for fear that Bingley's younger sister Caroline might discover his plan and insist upon joining them. Because he was staying at Netherfield with his friend, and because Caroline was presiding over her brother's table, she supposed she was one of Darcy's intimate friends. She could not have been more mistaken, but as he had done nothing to elevate her hopes, he felt little inclined to deflate them. He immediately recalled the conversation the evening before when their party had returned to Netherfield after the previous evening's gathering at Lucas Lodge. "You are considering how insupportable it would be to pass many evenings in this manner, in such society, and indeed I am quite of your opinion. I, for one, was never more annoyed. The insipidity, and yet the noise, the nothingness, and yet the self-importance of all those people. What would I give to hear your strictures on them?" "Your conjecture is totally wrong," he uttered in response to Caroline's teasing retort, meant once again to disparage her brother's new neighbors. He had concluded by saying, "I assure you, my mind was more agreeably engaged. I have been meditating on the very great pleasure which a pair of fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman can bestow." It simply would not do for him to let her know he had promised to call on the young lady who had the credit of inspiring such a telling reflection. Poised to enter Longbourn Manor for the first time ever, Darcy reminded himself once again what he was about. "I would never forgive myself if I did not explore this tender regard I suffer for Miss Elizabeth." Soon enough, he was shown into the parlor where 6 women of varying degrees of beauty and poise stood awaiting him. "We are honored by this visit, Mr. Darcy. How considerate of you indeed," Mrs. Bennet said, as soon as all the usual civilities were exchanged. "However, where is your friend Mr. Bingley? Pray, he has not returned to London again." "Bingley remains at Netherfield," Darcy replied. "That is welcome news indeed. Why, soon on the heels of his initial arrival in Hertfordshire, he was unable to accept an invitation to dinner here at Longbourn because he was obliged to be in town the following day. I was beginning to fear he might always be hurrying about from one place to another, and never settled at Netherfield as he ought to be." Darcy knew not what to say in response to Mrs. Bennet's declaration, and thus he remained silent. Caroline Bingley's shrill voice teasing him on what a charming mother-in-law the woman seated across from him would not be silenced. "And of course she will always be at Pemberley with you." He shook his head imperceptibly to clear away such thoughts. It is one thing to entertain such notions as a means of vexing Miss Bingley, but it is much too soon to countenance these sorts of ideas at such a time as this. "And what about you, Mr. Darcy? Is it your intention to remain in Hertfordshire for very long, or will you soon be returning to your own home in Derbyshire?" Darcy cleared his throat. "My plans remain unfixed. That said, I do not anticipate leaving any time soon." Here he paused a moment and gazed at the second eldest Bennet daughter, who was sitting too far away for his comfort. "Certainly not so long as I have ample reason to stay." It secretly pleased him when he noticed the undeniable object of his admiration, color. "Capital!" Mrs. Bennet exclaimed. As if touched by a stroke of genius, she cried, "Lizzie, my dear, what a pleasant morning this is to go to Oakham Mount. It is a nice long walk, and Mr. Darcy has never seen the view, I am sure." She looked at the gentleman, and in response to his silent confirmation of her speech, she continued, "Mary, Kitty, and Lydia, I insist you join your sister and our guests." Each of the 3 younger sisters objected to this scheme in their turn, concluding with young Lydia, who cried, "Why can't Jane accompany them? She is the oldest, and I am sure she has nothing better to do, whereas Kitty and I have made plans to walk to Meriden. I am sure I require Jane to remain here with me. Mary, you must be the one to accompany your sister and Mr. Darcy." In the wake of Mary's ensuing protest, Jane stood. "I am happy to walk to Oakham Mount." "Thank you, Jane," Elizabeth said, standing. Before her eager mamma could protest, she looked at Mr. Darcy. "Sir, will you pardon my sister and me while we go upstairs to get our bonnets?" "I shall eagerly await your return." On the way to Oakham Mount, Elizabeth, Jane, and their gentleman companion chanced upon Elizabeth's intimate friend, Miss Charlotte Lucas, who was on her way to Longbourn. The 4 of them greeted each other in the usual way, and thereupon decided that Charlotte, an excellent walker in her own right, would accompany her friends. This made for a more comfortable arrangement, relieving Jane of the burden of being a third in a cozy picture of 2. But it settled upon Elizabeth the daunting task of walking side by side with Mr. Darcy, whose taciturn nature was on full display. Each step took the couples farther and farther apart from each other, and soon the 2 ladies had outpaced Darcy and Elizabeth by a considerable distance. This sight of her walking companion was not foreign to Elizabeth, but as he had been the one to call on her, she rather expected him to exert a greater attempt at liveliness. As if for no other reason than to silence her own internal debate, Elizabeth said, "I must credit my mamma with one thing. It is indeed a lovely day for a walk." She almost regretted her speech, fearing the introduction of such a threadbare topic as the weather would hardly portend well for any meaningful intercourse. When he merely responded in a monotone syllable, she sought to speak directly on a more substantive matter. "I too share my mamma's curiosity as regards your plans to remain in Hertfordshire, sir. I should imagine any number of places that you would find infinitely more desirable than the small confines of Meriden. In saying that, you have confirmed something I have long suspected about you." "Oh, and what is that?" "Your recognition of the somewhat limiting confines of this part of the country assures me that you are well-traveled. Do you spend a great deal of time in London, or Bath perhaps? You cannot always have been at Longbourn." "While I have had ample opportunity to spend time in London with my aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, I am afraid I am not quite so worldly as you suppose, nor anywhere near so well-traveled as I would wish. My father's hatred of London is only exceeded by his disdain of every other place beyond Longbourn village." Not wanting to leave it at that, she said, "I suppose that is the reason I am so interested in reading. I am able to immerse myself so thoroughly in a good book that I often feel as though I am a part of it." I am delighted to say that I share my own passion for books. Indeed, my propensity to lose myself in a good book has often been cited by those who know me best as a failing. If such a thing as losing yourself in a good book is deemed a failing, then it is good to know I find myself in such estimable company, Elizabeth said, smiling. Finally, a topic worthy of discussion on this, her first walk with Mr. Darcy, and one that excited both their passions no less. A pleasing start indeed. Chapter 4. Speaking in Confidence. A few days later, breakfast was scarcely over when a servant from Netherfield brought the following note from Jane for Elizabeth. "My dearest Lizzie," the letter began, "I find myself very unwell this morning, which I suppose is to be impugned to my getting wet through yesterday. My kind friends will not hear of my returning till I am better. They also insist on my seeing Mr. Jones. Therefore, do not be alarmed if you should hear of his having been to me, and, excepting a sore throat and headache, there is not much the matter with me. Yours, etc." As much as Elizabeth wished to attend her sister, who no doubt had fallen ill after having traveled on horseback to the neighboring estate of Netherfield Park during a rainstorm, she was not entirely impervious to how her arrival might appear to those who were inclined to judge her. Her sister Mary's words played out in her mind. "I admire the activity of your benevolence, but every impulse of feeling should be guided by reason, and, in my opinion, exertion should always be in proportion to what is required." Even her mother had been wary of the scheme, albeit for different reasons. Elizabeth sighed in recollection of her mother's speech. "How can you be so silly?" Mrs. Bennet had complained. "What will Mr. Darcy think when you arrive? Unfit to be seen. Surely such a spectacle will give him considerable pause, and thus undo all our hard work to get him to marry you." It would have been pointless to argue with her mother, whose business in life was getting rid of her unwed daughters. In truth, marrying Mr. Darcy had not even crossed Elizabeth's mind. Not exactly, and thus she held her tongue. Her father had also voiced some measure of concern by offering to call for the horses so Elizabeth might take the carriage. Fancying herself an excellent walker, she had declined the gesture. "I appreciate my family's concerns, but as my reasons have everything to do with being by my sister's side, I can hardly allow them to persuade me against my purposes. My sister means everything to me, and I shall not neglect her, even if it means losing Mr. Darcy's good opinion." Undeterred, Elizabeth hurried on her way, crossing field after field with abandon, at a determined pace. At last, she found herself within view of the house. Elizabeth was immediately shown into the breakfast parlor, and found the room occupied by Mr. Bingley and his sister, Miss Bingley. She breathed a sigh of relief that Mr. Darcy was not present, thus sparing her the potential embarrassment of his seeing her in such a state as her mother had predicted, her hair windswept, and her hem 6 inches deep in mud. Shortly after all the necessary pleasantries the occasion afforded, Miss Bingley tore herself away from the table and proceeded to escort Elizabeth to her sister's bedside. To Elizabeth's dismay, none other than Mr. Darcy entered the room. The two of them had barely exchanged greetings before Miss Bingley cried, "Pray come along, Miss Eliza. You have ventured too far, by foot no less, to keep your dear sister waiting." Elizabeth readily conceded, and the two of them went on their way. The young lady wasted no time showing Elizabeth to Jane's room before returning downstairs to the others. Elizabeth walked to her sister's side. There Jane slept peacefully. As much as she wanted to let her sister know that she was there, Elizabeth did not have the heart to awaken Jane from her restful slumber. Consoling herself with the awareness that the Bingleys were indeed taking prodigious care of Jane, Elizabeth scanned the room for a convenient place to sit and wait for Jane to stir. No sooner had she resolved to sit in a large comfortable chair by the window did she remember that in her haste to be by Jane's side, she had escaped Longbourn without the book she had been reading the evening before. "I suppose I might find something to read in the library," she considered. She looked back at Jane for a moment or two and then quit the room. "I am sure I shall find a book to read and return to my dearest Jane's side in no time at all." When she arrived at the bottom of the stairs, Elizabeth was pleasantly surprised to espy a footman, for although she had a sense of the location of Mr. Bingley's library, she wanted to be sure. He must have read her inquisitive expression. "May I be of service to you, madam?" "Indeed. May I inquire about the direction of the library?" "It is down the hallway, 3 doors on the left. I am happy to escort you." She held up her hand. "No, thank you. I believe I am able to find it on my own." With that said, she walked away, grateful that it was only a footman that she had encountered, and not one of the Bingley sisters. While it was true that the two of them were kind enough to Jane, their tolerance for Elizabeth was considerably less, although not at all unlike Elizabeth's level of tolerance for the two of them. "The sooner I am away from Netherfield, the better for all parties concerned." Moments later, Elizabeth pushed the door of the library open and peeked inside. If either of the Bingley sisters were present, she would forego the pleasure of a book. She breathed a sigh of relief upon observing the room appeared to be empty. She stepped inside. A quick glance in the direction of the stacks did not bode well for her reading prospects. Nevertheless, determined to be pleased with whatever she might find, Elizabeth proceeded directly across the richly carpeted floor. The sound of a gentleman clearing his throat halted her steps. She turned. "Mr. Darcy." He walked toward her, bowed, and said, "Miss Elizabeth." Remembering herself, Elizabeth curtsied. "I trust you found your sister, Miss Bennet, to be well taken care of?" "Yes, it would appear so." Feeling the awkwardness of her current situation and the possibility that she had intruded on the gentleman's privacy, she said, "Actually, Jane was resting so peacefully when I looked in on her that I did not dare awaken her, not knowing all the particulars of the morning. I thought I would come here and pick out a book to read while I waited for her to awaken." He glanced over at the mostly empty bookshelves. "I do not know that you will have much luck in that endeavor. Might I suggest you have a look at this?" Mr. Darcy asked, referring to the book he was holding. "I do not dare accept your kind offer, sir. I fear my being here uninvited may be viewed as an impertinence. I should not wish to compound my transgression by claiming your reading material." "No, I insist. Besides, I have read this book before. It is one of my own that I am forced to read again, owing to the scarcity in my friend Bingley's library. I believe you will enjoy the book very much. In fact, you are welcome to bring it to Longbourn upon your return." She accepted the proffered book with a tentative smile. "Sir, you are very kind." Their eyes met. For a time, it seemed neither was willing to be the first to look away. At length, Elizabeth withdrew hers. "Sir?" she spoke tentatively. "Yes," he replied softly. Their eyes fixed on each other's once again. "Will you allow me to apologize if it seems that I have deliberately placed myself in your path? I assure you that was not my intention." "Are you referring to coming here to be by your ailing sister's side?" "You might have questioned if my doing so was ill-advised, especially in view of my appearance. My hem is 6 inches deep in mud, my hair windswept and unkempt, and my expression, no doubt, hurried and wild-eyed." He laughed just a little at Elizabeth's description of herself. "I am not one who normally takes note of a lady's wardrobe. As for your hair, I found it quite refreshing, loosely draping your shoulders. And as for your eyes, I find they were brightened by the exercise." Elizabeth felt her color rise in response to his warm words, and she began to sense that all would be well, whatever was the opinion of Bingley's sisters on her being there. Mr. Darcy did not share their feelings. "Miss Bennet is very fortunate to have a sister as loving and supportive as you. I would wish for no less for my own sister, Georgiana. As her older brother, indeed her only brother, I am sure you must dote on Miss Darcy exceedingly." "Indeed I do, but it is not quite the same. There is the matter of the difference in our ages. She is my junior by more than a decade." Her spirits rising to playfulness, Elizabeth said, "With 4 sisters in total, I am sure I would gladly lend at least one of them to Miss Darcy." Once again he laughed a little, and Elizabeth could only imagine it had to do with his thought on how his sister would get along with girls so silly as Kitty and Lydia. If such were indeed his sentiments, he did not speak on it. In all their time together, since he had called on her at Longbourn, he had never uttered a disparaging word against her younger sisters, regardless of their antics. He said, "I sense that you have longed for a brother somewhere along the way." She sighed. "More than you know," Elizabeth said wistfully. "A male heir to our family's estate would have made all the difference in the world, I am sure." Just saying the words out loud pained her. But there was something about her companion's manner that made it easier to confess her most worrisome concerns. It cannot be easy not knowing what your family's future might be, should some ill fate befall your father. Then you understand why my mamma may at times appear rather impolitic. He nodded. "I do. Pray tell me, do you know who is the heir apparent of your father's estate?" Elizabeth shook her head. "I have never met him. On the one occasion when I spoke on the matter to my father, he said there has been a long-standing disagreement with that particular branch of our family tree." "Which must confound your family's apprehensions even more." "Indeed, as my mother likes to say, we might be thrown out in the hedgerows as soon as my father passes." "Pray that such an event as she espouses will never unfold." Smiling tentative, she bit her lower lip. "I certainly did not mean to burden you with my worries, sir." "You did not, Miss Elizabeth. Nothing pleases me more than spending time with you. While I join you in praying for your sister's speedy recovery, I shall not be unhappy to have the chance to spend more time getting better acquainted with you." Images of Miss Bingley's reaction to such a declaration sprang to Elizabeth's mind. "I can think of at least one or two people who might take umbrage with such a prospect and balk at the impropriety." As if speaking in confidence, Darcy leaned closer to Elizabeth. "We must be careful to avoid giving rise to suspicion. Do you not consider that such a thing is easier said than done? Are we not alone at this very moment, with no one to attest to what the two of us are doing?" He tucked his hands behind his back. "Your point is well taken. Shall I step outside into the hallway and summon a footman to attend us?" Elizabeth clutched Mr. Darcy's book to her chest. She smiled. "That will not be necessary. Now that you have satisfied my reason for being here by lending me your book, I think it is time for me to return to my sister's side." "Of course, I shall not delay you a moment longer. I will, however, ask that you do not hesitate to seek me out if you are in need of anything at all. I am at your service." "I shall take your offer into consideration, sir." Curtsying, she then turned away and proceeded to quit the room. A warm feeling washed over her when she glanced over her shoulder and saw that he was still looking at her in the manner that she had now come to appreciate as admiration. Chapter 5. This Different Temptation. Rosings Park, Kent. Mr. William Collins pushed out his chest as he strode proudly through the halls of Rosings. Being summoned by his noble patroness, the estimable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, was no small matter. Her time was valuable, as she often pointed out. Whatever was the reason for her summons must surely have been of vital importance. Memories of the first time he came to Rosings Park some while ago lingered in his mind, as clearly as if it had been the day before. The grandeur of it all never failed to impress him. The fact that her ladyship was personally involved in improving his own humble abode reminded him on a daily basis of what a blessing the grand lady had bestowed upon him in giving him the living in Hunsford. When he was shown into the parlor, Collins walked reverently to where her ladyship sat and bowed. "Lady Catherine, thank you for your generous invitation. It is indeed a pleasure to attend you. How might I be of service?" A tall, dignified woman with strongly marked features, which might well have given her cause to proclaim herself one of the handsomest women of all at one time. Her ladyship purposely eyed the gilded mantel clock. "I summoned you over an hour ago. What on earth prevented you from arriving sooner?" "Pray forgive my tardiness, your ladyship. I was away from the parsonage doing all in my power to console the widow Scott and her daughters." The proud aristocrat scoffed. "Perhaps you will do me the honor of sparing me of such weak excuses in the future. You know how much I do not enjoy being made to wait on others. I promise I shall never be late again." "See that you are not. Pray have a seat, Mr. Collins, for there is a matter I wish to discuss, which I suppose will take some time." Although he was tall and his air stately, Mr. Collins was not one who might be described as a handsome man. He was a relatively young man of only 25, and he possessed the sort of temperament that was ideally suited for the honor her ladyship had generously bestowed upon him. In Lady Catherine's view, she had found the perfect person to do her bidding. When the tea things were set and the servant dismissed, her ladyship commenced her carefully crafted speech. I recall when I granted you the living, you mentioned that you were the heir to a small estate about 20 miles north of London. I believe you said it was Longbourn in Hertfordshire. Indeed, Longbourn is the name of my future home, barring any unforeseen circumstances, which I dare not expound on while in the presence of a lady. Nonsense. It is not as though I am a child, ignorant of the ways of the world. Your distant cousin and his wife have had the misfortune of having 5 daughters, and they are most likely beyond the point of conceiving another. It is indeed a shame that the females in the household will be forced to surrender every material thing they now call their own in the event of an untimely ill fate for their father. But you need not feel too wretched regarding their plight, for I have decided that you are the one person on this earth capable of righting the grievous injustice of your female cousin's birth and all its ensuing hardships. Indeed, I have decided that you, sir, must go to Hertfordshire and choose a wife from among the Bennet daughters. Having learned that her favorite nephew, Fitzwilliam Darcy, had travelled to Hertfordshire shortly after Michaelmas to visit his friend Charles Bingley, Lady Catherine had grown increasingly concerned that the former would always be in the company of his friend's unwed sister, Miss Caroline Bingley. To say that her ladyship did not like the young woman was an understatement. Any young woman who would aspire to be the next mistress of Pemberley, a happy state predestined for her own daughter Anne, was someone whom Lady Catherine despised. Wishing to be kept abreast of all of Miss Bingley's endeavours toward that end, Lady Catherine secretly employed members of the Netherfield household staff to keep her informed. Her subsequent dismay upon learning that a country upstart from a neighbouring estate had attracted her nephew's notice proved quite disconcerting indeed. To Lady Catherine's way of thinking, this different temptation for her nephew posed a more significant threat to her daughter's future happiness, one that her vicar was in the most advantageous position of removing. Her ladyship continued, "From all that I have learned about that family, only 2 of the 5 daughters are capable of satisfying my requirements for what your wife ought to be. The first is the eldest daughter, Miss Jane Bennet. However, my sources have informed me that she is as good as engaged to a young man whose family hails from the north. That only leaves 1 Bennet daughter who meets my exacting requirements, and she happens to be the second born. From all that I am told, she is almost as beautiful as the eldest sister. Indeed, she is the Bennet daughter whom I have heard described as the brightest jewel of the country. The youngest Bennet daughters have been described as the silliest girls in all of England, and I absolutely will not abide a silly parson's wife in my midst. No, you must travel to Hertfordshire immediately, and you must marry the second Bennet daughter." She stood from her chair, signaling for Mr. Collins to do the same. "Goodbye, Mr. Collins. Pray, your ladyship, if you would be so kind as to tell me the name of this young lady to whom I am to offer my hand in marriage, I would be eternally in your debt. Her name is Miss Elizabeth Bennet." Chapter 6. A Generous Gesture. His hand behind his back, Darcy waited for Elizabeth as she headed toward him in the lane. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me like this, Miss Elizabeth. I realize it was not a trivial thing that I asked of you, but what else could I do? I believe I miss you even more, knowing we are residing under the same roof, albeit temporarily, and yet unable to see each other, to spend time away from the others so often as I would like. Owe it to my being a selfish man. I'm sorry if it seems I have been neglecting you, sir. You are here now, and I intend to make the most of our time together, for who is to say how long it will last? What is it that you have behind your back, sir, if you do not mind my asking?" "Oh, this," he said, revealing his hand, in it an arrangement of freshly picked flowers secured by ribbons, 1 scarlet-colored and 1 white. Accepting the proffered bouquet, Elizabeth said, "How lovely, sir! Are these for me?" "Yes," he said, nodding. "I picked them myself." Reading in her expression a modicum of disbelief, he asked, "Do you doubt me?" "It is just that I find it somewhat hard to believe you would go to so much trouble, what with rows of servants at your feet to attend such tasks. To what do I owe the honor of such a generous gesture? It has not escaped my notice how attentive you have been to your sister, and I began to ask myself, who is taking care of you? You are very kind to think of me, sir, to say nothing of your talents. This arrangement is stunning. There is also the matter of my feeling rather guilty in desiring so much of your attention. I am inclined to think it would be better for all concerned if I simply returned to town, at least until your sister no longer relies on you so much as she does." "No, do not do that, please, whatever you do. Do not leave. Why, exercising a bit of liberty, and seeing it was just the 2 of them, with not another soul in sight, Darcy placed a finger on Elizabeth's lips. "Hush," he said softly. "I speak only in jest. I have no wish to be parted from you, not now." Remembering himself, he tucked both hands behind his back. "So you are teasing me, Mr. Darcy?" "Are you not to be teased?" Her spirits rising to playfulness, Elizabeth said, "Oh, no. On the contrary, for I dearly love to laugh. I must warn you, however, that I give as good as I get. Now that you have been warned, what say you to that?" "I say only this. While I am a serious man, one who does not easily forget the follies and vices of others so soon as I ought, nor their offenses against me, any ensuing resentment is not so implacable as to render me wholly incapable of forgiveness, particularly toward those who mean the most to me." "Oh my, you are a serious man indeed. I should like to think I am safely among the latter." "Indeed, more than you know. Do you mean to suggest that I am on the same level as Miss Bingley?" He shook his head. "No, not at all. Miss Bingley, try as she might, has no effect on me at all." He spoke nothing but the truth, for that young lady was always taunting him in one way or another in her attempts to get him to dislike Elizabeth, always in vain. "Tease me, taunt me, challenge me at will. You are in no danger of losing my good opinion. I am forever your humble servant." At that moment, Darcy and Elizabeth were met from another walk by Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley herself. "I did not know you intended to walk, Mr. Darcy. I declare you used us abominably ill," said the younger of the two ladies. "You know how much my sister and I dearly love a good walk about the park with you. Yet you ran away without telling us you were going out." Acknowledging Elizabeth's presence, Miss Bingley said, "What a lovely bouquet of flowers, Miss Eliza. Did you gather them yourself?" Placing her hand over her mouth, she smirked. "Ah, of course you did. What on earth am I thinking?" Elizabeth held her bouquet to her nose and inhaled its intoxicatingly sweet fragrance. "Actually, they're a gift from an admirer." "No doubt an admirer with extraordinary taste," said Mr. Darcy, his voice tender. His eyes fixed on Elizabeth's, he continued, "Such beauty is impossible to resist." As though the intimate exchange between Darcy and Elizabeth was lost on them, the two ladies took either of the gentlemen's arms, which forced Elizabeth to walk by herself, for the path just admitted 3. Feeling their rudeness, Mr. Darcy immediately said, "This walk is not wide enough for our party. I suggest we go into the avenue instead." Elizabeth, who had not the least inclination of remaining in company with the Bingley sisters a second longer than she must, replied, "No, no, do not alter your course on my behalf. I fear I must return to the house as soon as can be, so that I might place this bouquet in a vase befitting its beauty. Far be it from me to allow my admirer's secret talents to be in vain." Chapter 7. Manifold Attraction. Even the prospect of spending time in company with Mr. Darcy had not been enough to overcome the unpleasantness of being an unwelcome guest of the Bingley sisters, and thus Elizabeth breathed a deep sigh of relief when her sister Jane and she entered Longbourn after nearly a week's absence. Alas, her joy was to be short-lived, for Longbourn was in the middle of welcoming a visitor. It was their cousin from Kent, Mr. William Collins. He was a tall, heavy-looking man, whose air was grave and stately. His manners were formal, and he talked a great deal with little encouragement, despite being surrounded by practical strangers. It did not take long for Elizabeth to see he thought very highly of himself, as well as his accomplishments. Her discomfort increased with every moment spent in company with her cousin. It was not so much the proprietary manner in which he examined and appraised the house as a whole, the rooms, and even the furnishings, for he was Longbourn's presumptive heir, and thus only a heartbeat away from claiming all the Bennet's material possessions as his own. Rather, it was the way he examined and appraised her, too. "Does Mr. Collins suppose I am part of the furnishings in the house as well?" She was not at all pleased when the gentleman chose the seat next to her own when they were summoned to dinner. Now it was the meal's turn to be admired and favorably remarked upon. Oh, the pompous nothings on Mr. Collins's side, and the civil assents on the part of her mother, her sisters, and even her father were more than Elizabeth could stand, much less comprehend. She had not been away from Longbourn for a week, yet she felt as though she hardly knew these people, especially her mother, whose hatred of the visitor had been legendary because of the entail. When she could, Elizabeth sought out her father for some explanation of her cousin's surprise visit, and most importantly, his warm reception. Mr. Bennet could not say that he was not just as surprised as his daughter by her cousin's abrupt arrival, but he was able to offer some bit of encouragement, having discovered that there was a purpose to the man's visit, which must undoubtedly have elevated him in Mrs. Bennet's good graces. Indeed, Mr. Bennet had learned Mr. Collins was in want of a wife. So it is a wife the man seeks, she silently considered. I feel confident that I am safe from him, for Papa would never sanction a union between such an absurd man and me. As for her mother's sentiments, Elizabeth was rather less assured. She decided she would stay as far away from her cousin during his visit as decent civility would allow, a feat that might prove easier said than done, she feared, but she would do her very best. Later that evening, Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Collins sat away from the others, embroiled in a hushed tete-a-tete. I am very sensible, madam, of the hardship to my fair cousins, and having assessed each of them in their turn, save the eldest two, I have found them wanting. As if aware that his statement may have come across as rude and precipitous, he immediately added, that is not to say that the younger three are not agreeable in each of their own ways. It is simply that my requirements in choosing a wife, which, as you are fully aware, is the primary purpose of my being here, are rather exacting. What a disheartening thing to hear for a mother who had all but gotten rid of the very two daughters whom he admired the most. Not quite willing to relinquish the idea of having 3 daughters married, Mrs. Bennet said, Sir, if you would but perhaps have a second look, I am sure you will find my youngest a most appealing choice. Not only is she the tallest of all my girls, but she is also the most agreeable by far. Then I shall rest assured that your youngest will have no problem in securing a most advantageous alliance, what with all her manifold attractions. As for myself, only 2 of your daughters warrant any serious consideration on my part. He nodded. Indeed, one stands out far and above the other. I do not mind confiding in you that I have heard her described as the brightest jewel in the country, and having spent time in company with her, I have no doubt as to the reason she has garnered such acclaim. She is quite unlike any young lady I have had the pleasure of meeting, and I shall be delighted to share my future life with her. Sensing that the gentleman sitting opposite her was determined to be steadfast, posed quite the conundrum for Mrs. Bennet. He had given the strongest hint that between Jane and Elizabeth, the latter was his choice. But surely she and her husband had a say in the matter. Oh, what a dilemma, between the exceedingly agreeable Mr. Bingley and the handsome Mr. Darcy. Mrs. Bennet was hard-pressed to decide which of the 2 men she preferred as a future son-in-law more, Mrs. Jane Bingley or Miss Elizabeth Darcy, she silently considered. Truth be told, I like the idea of both future appellations for my girls. Jane, the mistress of Netherfield, one of the finest estates in the neighborhood, £5,000 a year. Lizzie, the mistress of Pemberley, purportedly one of the grandest estates in all of Derbyshire, £10,000 a year. The lady's heartbeat fluttered. £10,000 a year. Was there any other conclusion? Mr. Collins, the calculating matriarch began, I am given to suspect you have singled out my Lizzie as the companion of your future life, but I find myself quite unable to understand your reasoning. It is my Jane who is the true beauty of the family. He nodded. That may very well be, but unless I am mistaken, your eldest is practically engaged to another. Feigning shock, she replied, Heavens! Where on earth did you hear such a thing? Suffice it to say, I learned of it from an impeccable source, one whose word is not to be impeached under any circumstances. I surely do not intend to waste my time on a young lady who has given her heart to another. I am not used to being anyone's second choice. But, Mr. Collins, if what you assert is true, then I feel that it is incumbent on me to tell you that Lizzie's situation is not too dissimilar from Jane's. My Lizzie also has an admirer. Collins arched his brow. Oh? Pray, who is the lucky gentleman who has encouraged your hopes regarding Cousin Elizabeth's marital prospects? Mrs. Bennet lowered her voice. Well, nothing is official, mind you. However, then it is as you say. Nothing is official, and thus I have no reason to amend my original assertion as regards my intentions toward Cousin Elizabeth. Finding herself in no position to argue her point without risking the alienation of all the parties concerned in the matter, for she was beginning to suspect that Mr. Darcy's aunt had sanctioned her parson's actions, vexed her. Since his arrival, the parson had frequently spoken of his noble patroness. Not knowing the extent to which the nephew may have been in the aunt's power, Mrs. Bennet struggled to find her voice. But, she said. Collins held up his hand. Mind you, I fully intend to court my fair cousin properly, adhering to all the rules of decorum before bestowing her all my heart and soul and ultimately offering my hand in marriage. You need not worry on that account. But, sir, I am pleased beyond measure to know that you and I are of the same mind, and I shall rely on your support when the time comes, although I do not suppose I will need it. If I know nothing else about the female persuasion, I wager your daughter will be more than appreciative of all that I have to offer. Chapter 8. Lapse and Etiquette. A couple days later, while walking along the path to the stream that flowed behind Longbourn village, Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth came across a makeshift bench fashioned decades past from a large tree stump. "Shall we sit and rest, Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth inquired. The gentleman nodded. "I would like that, Miss Elizabeth." He gestured for her to take a seat, and then he did likewise. Crossing one long leg over the other, he said, "This is a lovely spot." "Indeed it is. I rarely come here any more, but it was a favorite escape for me when I was younger." He threw a lingering glance over the landscape. "I certainly see why. I can imagine you coming here with a good book in hand and losing yourself in its pages." They talked in that manner for a while before Mr. Darcy sought to speak on another matter weighing on his mind. "I notice that your sisters are very fond of walking to Meryton. Do you share their enthusiasm for such outings?" "I am not nearly so enthusiastic as Kitty and Lydia, but I occasionally join them, along with Jane and Mary. We have an aunt on my mother's side who lives in Meryton, and she is always delighted by the prospect of receiving visitors." "I see. However, you are aware, I am sure, that the militia recently encamped on the outskirts of Meryton. I am certain I need not be concerned with your safety, but your sisters are so young. I fear I would be remiss were I not to encourage a bit of prudence on their part. Officers are indeed perceived to be among the most honorable of gentlemen, but one would be foolish not to realize that there are bad characters to be found masquerading among even the most honorable of men." "Are you speaking of officers in general, or one officer in particular, Mr. Darcy?" "To be perfectly honest with you, the latter. It has been brought to my attention that an old acquaintance of mine from Derbyshire has recently joined the militia, the very same militia encamped outside of Meryton. I have not had the opportunity of meeting an officer who hails from Derbyshire just yet, but as I value your good opinion, I shall certainly take your words under advisement if or when I do." "You cannot know how much it means to me to hear you say that, Miss Elizabeth," said Mr. Darcy. "Which part, sir? That I value your good opinion, or that I will be guarded in the event that I meet the particular officer?" "Actually both, but chiefly the former. I did not always have your good opinion, and I am delighted to know that I have earned it. Having done so, I shall do all in my power to keep it." Later in the week, save Mrs. Bennet and Mary, the ladies of Longbourn walked to Meryton along with their cousin, whom Mr. Bennet had insisted must accompany his daughters. It was not that he was usurping his wife's job as a matchmaker in the family. He merely wanted a lengthy reprieve from Collins's ceaseless discourse centering on his humble abode, his garden, and most of all, his noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Elizabeth employed her talents as an excellent walker to her best advantage, and outpaced her party, leaving her cousins caretaking to Jane, for the younger girls had neither the inclination nor the temperaments to be bothered. When at last they entered Meryton, however, the attention of every young lady was soon caught by a young man whom they had never seen before. Donned in regimentals, his appearance was greatly in his favor, for he had all the best parts of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and a very pleasing air. As he was accompanied by an officer named Mr. Denny, with whom the Longbourn ladies were already acquainted, the highly sought introductions were made when the gentlemen joined their party. It was soon discovered that the officer, who had captured more than his fair share of admiration, especially from the younger girls, hailed from Derbyshire. His name was Mr. George Wickham. Elizabeth recalled Mr. Darcy advising her to be wary of a then unnamed officer from Derbyshire. Evidently, Mr. Darcy had not been alluding to the gentleman standing before her, for Mr. Wickham's conversation was happy and his manners were impeccable. If Mr. Wickham and the officer to whom Mr. Darcy alluded are one and the same, I must endeavor to discover what is the source of Mr. Darcy's contempt. The sound of horses soon drew everyone's notice, and taught Elizabeth to hope Her curiosity would soon be satisfied, for none other than Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy himself were espied riding down the street. What was more, the gentlemen were headed their way. Just as suddenly, to her dismay, only Mr. Bingley joined their party, for no sooner than his friend laid eyes on Mr. Wickham did he turn and ride away. What could be the meaning of such a lapse in etiquette? Not only did Mr. Darcy fail to exercise a modicum of civility akin to that of his friend, but he also did not even bother to acknowledge me. Chapter 9. Happiness is Fleeting. Darcy surmised that some explanation of his behavior was necessary. His happiness depended upon it, and indeed, he could honestly say he was a happy man. Undeniably, he was happier than he could recall being in the past few years. Looking back, he never really knew how unhappy he was. Why then do I feel my happiness is fleeting? He knew the answer to the question. The answer he thought about each day, because at the root of his happiness was spending time with Miss Elizabeth Bennet. He never thought for one instant that in agreeing to come to Hertfordshire with his friend, he would meet a young woman who would bewitch him like no other woman he had ever met. And yet he had, which made his situation all the more tenuous, for as much as he admired the charming young woman, nothing would ever become of it. Or would it, Darcy asked himself. He was, after all, his own master, and should fate one day deem that Miss Elizabeth was indeed the woman with whom he might one day fall in love, the woman he might one day ask to be his wife, then nothing anyone could say or do would alter him from his course. Darcy shook his head. If I am not careful, I might succumb to the same lovesick malady that seems to have affected my friend Charles Bingley. He, along with the rest of the Netherfield party, had arrived at Longbourn not too long ago to deliver invitations to Bingley's upcoming ball by hand. On second thought, his situation was not so dire as Bingley's. Of that Darcy was certain. Such was his firm conviction as he sat there and observed the overly affected manner in which his friend attended the eldest Bennet daughter. This he noticed even though his eyes were trained on the door in eager anticipation of the arrival of the next eldest sister. Where is she? He silently asked himself as he fought hard against consulting his watch for the third time in as many minutes. It did not help at all that the two youngest Bennet daughters appeared quite entertained by his situation, judging by their relentless giggling. Lydia, the youngest of the two, finally addressed him. "Mr. Darcy, you just missed my sister Lizzie. She went for a walk to Oakham Mount. No doubt she will be ever so sorry to have missed you." With that, the girls recommenced their antics. It would have been too obvious were Darcy to simply stand and quit the room upon hearing this. Thus, he remained in the same attitude. When at last the Netherfield party quit the house, and they were about to board the carriage, Darcy said, "If you will forgive me, Bingley, I believe I will return to Netherfield." Miss Bingley cried, "If Mr. Darcy is returning, what say we all return? He is our special guest after all. We must not abandon him. I am certain we can prevail on one of the servants to deliver the remaining of the invitations to our neighbors." Darcy held up his hand. "Pray do not alter your plans on my behalf. Bingley, you and your sisters must continue to deliver the invitations to your neighbors. It is only proper. Besides, it is such a fine day for a walk after being confined to the indoors for so long." At length, Miss Bingley gave up her protests, and soon they were on their way in the carriage, leaving Darcy to his own devices. Not a moment too soon, so far as Darcy was concerned. His desire to see Miss Elizabeth Bennet would no longer be repressed. He set off on the path leading not to Netherfield Park, but to Oakham Mount. He did not walk very far before spying Elizabeth just ahead on the lane, heading back to Longbourn village. He stopped and waited for her. "This is a lovely surprise," Elizabeth said, when the two of them were standing face to face. "I was just at Longbourn with Bingley and his family. He wanted to deliver your family's invitation to his upcoming ball personally." "I would say that I am sorry to have missed him, except that is not entirely true." "His sisters say no more. However, I trust you will not allow your opinion of Bingley's sisters to affect your decision to attend the ball." "You sound as though you might suffer a measure of disappointment should I decline." "I would indeed, for I am relying on you to attend." "Oh? Whom else shall I stand opposite on the dance floor, if not you?" Darcy asked teasingly. Elizabeth really liked this side of her gentleman companion. Their easy manner when in each other's company was something she, at one time, would never have imagined possible. Yet here they were. Indeed, she really could not imagine it any other way. That said, there was a matter between them that begged discussion. "There is something that I have been meaning to ask you about for quite a while." "And what is that?" "The last time I had the pleasure of seeing you, I was left with the distinct impression that you did not share in my pleasure. You barely acknowledged my party in me." "I pray you will forgive me, for I surely did not intend to give you such an unfavorable impression." "I must say I am relieved to hear that. However, I am very curious to know the source of your obvious displeasure. Was it a consequence of me and my sisters conversing with some of the officers in the militia?" "It is not so much that you were conversing with the officers. In general, officers are indeed among the most honorable of men. It is more of a matter of a specific officer who was among your party." "Which officer?" "George Wickham." If Elizabeth were to judge by the air of disdain apparent in Mr. Darcy's tone upon voicing the lieutenant's name, her companion hated the officer. "Oh, my!" Elizabeth exclaimed, resting her hand lightly on her bosom. "The officer from Derbyshire? May I ask to what must the gentleman credit for having garnered such contempt?" "Am I so obvious?" "I am afraid so. How are the two of you acquainted again, if I might ask?" "Suffice it to say that I have known Wickham all my life. It is a most unfortunate acquaintance indeed." He ceased walking and faced her. "Pray, it has been far too long since the two of us have been in company. Let us not squander another moment speaking of such matters." "You are correct. It has been a very long time since we were last in company. It is for that reason we must have some conversation and do not dare speak of the weather," Elizabeth said. "Tell me what it is you wish to discuss, and I will do everything in my power to satisfy you, for I am forever your humble servant." "There is something I have been longing to discuss with you. I sense that you are a rather private person, which is why I have been hesitant to broach this particular subject. It is true, I guard my privacy most fastidiously, but I am always open to making an exception for you, Miss Elizabeth. Ask me anything." "Well, you already know so much about me. You have met nearly all my family and closest friends. You have been to my home any number of times, and yet, other than what I have heard from Miss Bingley regarding your beautiful home and your very accomplished sister, and my cousin, who happens to be your aunt's vicar, I know hardly anything at all about you." "Allow me to fill in some of the missing pieces of my life. As you say, you have heard Miss Bingley speak of my sister Georgiana. It is true, she is a very accomplished young lady, but I fear Miss Bingley may not have adequately illustrated my sister's character. You see, Georgiana is somewhat shy, and she is not nearly so fond of Miss Bingley as the latter would have everyone believe. As for the other members of my family, I trust you know that both my parents have passed. My mother passed away when my sister was a small child, barely old enough to have any real memories of their time together, and my father passed away a few years ago, just after I reached the age of majority." Elizabeth was indeed aware of that tragic aspect of Darcy's past. With now being the first chance to properly acknowledge her condolences, she did so. Darcy's countenance took an unreadable turn. After nodding slightly in acknowledgment of Elizabeth's sympathies, he said, "You are very kind." After a pause, he said, "I can only imagine what your cousin may have said about my aunt Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and my cousin Anne for that matter. No doubt he bestowed upon the two of them the highest of praise. I am sure there is little more that I can add, except to say, to know my aunt is to meet my aunt. I trust in time you'll come to know exactly what I mean. As for Anne, she is one of 3 cousins. The other 2 are the Viscount, Lord Robert Fitzwilliam, and Colonel Richard Fitzwilliam. They are the sons of my uncle and aunt, Lord and Lady Matlock." Here Darcy shrugged a little and said, "I wish I could go on, but in truth, the size of my family is relatively small. That said, we are a very close-knit group, with a keen sense of obligation and a fierce sense of loyalty." "And what of your home?" Elizabeth asked. "I have heard it said that you own half of Derbyshire, and Miss Bingley's praise of Pemberley is effusive." Darcy laughed a little in hearing this. "I cannot say that I own half of Derbyshire, but the part that I do own is indeed magnificent, and it is not that I am wont to brag about my own property, but as it is the product of many generations of Darcy ancestors, I readily confess to being proud." His voice teeming with hints of nostalgia, Darcy went on to describe Pemberley Woods in the words of some of his closest friends and acquaintances, upon seeing it for the first time. especially Pemberley House, which was situated on the opposite side of a valley, and to which the road wound with some abruptness. It was a large, handsome stone building, standing well on high ground, and backed by a ridge of high woody hills. In front ran a stream of some natural importance. Its banks were neither formal or falsely adorned. What he did not say was how he hoped that Miss Elizabeth would one day have the pleasure of seeing his home for herself. He could not, for it was far too early in their acquaintance for such an admission. Who is to say if or when it may happen? A man may certainly dream. Chapter 10. Symptoms of Affection. Miss Charlotte Lucas always admired her friend Elizabeth. Elizabeth had that sort of spiritness about her that those who knew her best could not help but admire. Not yet 21, she had an affectionate heart, and yet it had remained wholly untouched so far as Charlotte could tell. That was not to say she did not consider herself quite the proficient when it came to understanding the ways of love. Her love of reading was second only to her love of walking. Indeed, Elizabeth considered herself quite the proficient at both. Thus, when Mr. Bingley, a single young man with an excellent fortune of £5,000 a year, chose her eldest sister Jane as the object of his affection, almost from the first moment he laid eyes on her, Elizabeth suffered not a single shred of doubt that the man loved her sister. In her estimation, he would have to be a fool not to be madly in love with Jane. What a tall order for a young man of Mr. Bingley's temperament, one who was always falling in love with angels almost everywhere he went, or so it was said. But what proof was there of his lack of constancy in Jane's case? One simply did not admire a young woman for weeks, and always to the exclusion of other young ladies longing for his attention for no reason. Such behavior was usually the most dependable symptom of being in love. That is according to Charlotte's intimate friend Elizabeth's way of thinking. Others recognized Mr. Charles Bingley's deep affection toward Miss Jane Bennet as well, Mrs. Bennet especially. However, as Jane's mother, Mrs. Bennet's feelings on this subject could easily be dismissed as biased, even self-serving. Charlotte's observations could not be so easily discounted. She would have no reason to espy symptoms of affection where there was indeed nothing there, although Miss Lucas had no more experience in affairs of the heart than did her dear friend Elizabeth. She fancied herself just as proficient, if not more so. She was, after all, nearly 27, which not only made her older than her friend, but also wiser and more practical. Although she could see clearly that Charles Bingley admired Jane Bennet very much, she knew better than to suppose that such a tender regard might not be fleeting. She was therefore persuaded that unless Jane did something to move Mr. Bingley along, his temperament might lead to the eventual waning of his ardor. The eldest daughter of Sir William Lucas, Charlotte was practical, and for good reason. Her family, whose circumstances were somewhat wanting despite her father's ascension to knighthood, depended upon her marrying. The sooner, the better. By her own admission, she was a burden to her parents. Indeed, she woke up every morning with a nagging feeling that unless she married soon, she might be compelled to seek employment. Being a gently bred young woman, even if a spinster, her employment options were few. Becoming a lady's maid was not entirely out of the question, for she was, after all, the daughter of a knight. Her mother was Lady Lucas. There was also the possibility that she might seek employment as a governess, although her education was not all that it might have been. Surely there was some unruly child somewhere in England in want of sensible guidance. Charlotte frowned at the idea of what her appellation may then become, Mrs. Lucas. I cannot say with certainty that such will never be the case, but I can say with absolute assuredness that I will not proceed easily into such a fate. I shall do everything in my power to find a husband. I am not of an age to be too strict in my standards. At a minimum, I pray that the gentleman is decent, honest, and a good provider. She thought of what her future husband might do to provide for her future marital felicity. Be he a country lawyer, a vicar, an officer in Her Majesty's army. Additionally, Charlotte was not opposed to marrying a merchant. She was not too proud to remember her father's own origins. More than anything, she simply wanted to be mistress of her own home, be it grand or not so grand. It simply did not matter. All that mattered was that it would be a home she could call her own. The evening of the Netherfield ball, all that Charlotte saw was merry and gay. She surveyed the room with the idea of finding a husband. The past months had seen several potential husbands come into the area. Mr. Charles Bingley, the aforementioned single young man who had let Netherfield Park after a long absence of a tenant. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, a tall, handsome gentleman who hailed from Derbyshire and was reported to have £10,000 a year. Mr. William Collins, a vicar and the future heir of Longbourn. And finally, an entire militia, which included the very dashing Lieutenant George Wickham. Ironically enough, Mrs. Bennet had, in one way or another, singled out at least 2 of the eligible men for her own daughters. But why should I accept Mrs. Bennet's preference as final? Am I not just as entitled to my own share of attention from one of the newcomers? Am I not just as worthy as any of the Bennet daughters? One by one, Charlotte considered what it must be like to be married to either of the aforementioned gentlemen. The first thought that came to mind with respect to Mr. Bingley was the disparity in their ages. No. Should I allow the disparity in our ages to be a consideration, then I must immediately rule out Mr. Collins as well. It is enough that Mr. Bingley only has eyes for Jane. Though not so close to Jane as she was to Elizabeth, Charlotte was much too fond of Jane to take advantage of Jane's shy disposition by pursuing Mr. Bingley herself. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy then came to mind. Charlotte laughed a little at this idea of a possible alliance with such a man. He had made it clear that he was above his company. He had even insulted her intimate friend Elizabeth by stating aloud that she was not handsome enough to tempt him soon after his arrival in Hertfordshire. Charlotte had always been considered as plain, even by her own mother. She supposed if the proud man described Elizabeth Bennet, often cited as the brightest jewel in the country, in such disparaging terms, what must be his opinion of her, assuming he even noticed her? Not that it matters, she reasoned. A man who values physical beauty as a benchmark in garnering his affection is not exactly the sort of man who might garner mine. As far as the militia was concerned, specifically the dashing Lieutenant George Wickham, as best as she could tell, he was in no position to satisfy her most ardent goal in marrying, that was to be mistress of her own home. She had heard his tales of woe, his claims of being a lowly footman, despite frequent repetitions of all his life ought to have been. She could well imagine spending the first years of marriage to a man of so little means still living at Lucas Lodge, still being a burden to her family. Charlotte's roaming eye landed on the next viable option for a potential suitor, Mr. William Collins. There was just one problem. Mrs. Bennet had made it perfectly clear to everyone who would listen that the gentleman had arrived in Hertfordshire with the express purpose of choosing a wife from among his fair cousins. The lady had given the strongest hints that the gentleman had already singled out the Bennet daughter of his choice, Charlotte's best friend, Elizabeth. Charlotte thought she knew her friend too well to suppose that Elizabeth would willingly go along with such a scheme. But what if Elizabeth were compelled to accept her cousin? Would she go against the stated wishes of her parents to marry the future heir of Longbourn, thus assuring her mother and her sisters would always have a home? There must have been some merit in the eager mamma's claim. What a spectacle Mr. Collins was making in prevailing himself on Elizabeth that evening. The 2 of them had danced the first set, and ever since then he seemed determined to remain close to Elizabeth's side. Charlotte read in her friend's face clear disgust. It is plain to see that Elizabeth wants nothing to do with the man. For that reason, I shall not rule out my prospects with the gentleman, not until I know with certainty my friend Elizabeth's intentions. Chapter 11. An Advantageous Prospect. Throughout the course of the evening, it appeared Charlotte was not the only person interested in the matter of Elizabeth's marital prospects. Word of Mr. Collins' intentions had spread throughout the crowd like wildfire. Miss Caroline Bingley was beside herself in eager anticipation of being the one to share the news with Mr. Darcy, judging by the way she jealously regarded the couple as Mr. Darcy attended Miss Eliza Bennet on the dance floor. How dare he single that young woman out in such an egregious manner? She silently complained. It did not help that he had not even bestowed such an honor to either her or her sister. She was standing directly in Darcy's path when he made his way from the dance floor. "Pardon, sir, but if you would be so kind as to accompany me, I would have a word with you in privacy." Perhaps you will give me leave to defer hearing whatever it is you wish to say to me until after your brother's guests have departed, thus ridding the need for privacy. I am afraid what I have to say simply will not wait for so long as that. Trust me that when you hear what I have learned, it will save you a great deal of trouble, for you see, it has to do with your special friend, Miss Elizabeth Bennet. It was not as though Darcy relished the idea of hearing anything that Miss Bingley might have to say about Elizabeth, but experience had taught him that the best way to silence the lady was to humor her. Otherwise, he might well imagine spending what was left of the evening avoiding her. He had not yet asked Elizabeth for a second set, but surely it was not beyond the range of possibility, to say nothing of the prospect of having supper with her. A few moments alone with Miss Bingley was all it took to change the course of Darcy's evening, and not in a good way. He was deeply disturbed by the things she said, and the self-satisfied, bordering on self-congratulatory manner in which she said them. Darcy did not dare allow his meddlesome companion to discern just how affected he was by this intelligence, but he was surely bothered. As soon as he could, he escaped the ballroom and went out on the terrace to have a breath of fresh air and clear his head. It is unfair to remain here in Hertfordshire and risk elevating Miss Elizabeth's expectations more than I may have done so already, when the one gentleman who has the means of removing all her family's worst fears for all time is ready and able to make an offer of marriage to her. And by what right am I to hinder such an advantageous prospect for all the Bennet family, when I am prepared to offer Miss Elizabeth Bennet nothing more than friendship? To stay is to risk raising her expectation, because it is not possible for me to remain here, so close to her, and not want to spend the better part of each day with her. The connection between us has exceeded the bounds of casual acquaintances, and as I am not prepared to offer anything more than friendship, in light of such a short duration of acquaintance as ours, I feel I must remove myself from the environs. Thus resolved, there was but one thing to do: a private audience with Miss Elizabeth at some point during the course of this evening is imperative. When Elizabeth could, she stole away from the ballroom for a private audience in the library, which Mr. Darcy had requested during the middle of their second set. As close as the two of them had become, she thought little of the impropriety. True, there was a chance the two of them might have been seen entering the library, but she was reasonably certain that would not be a bad thing. She trusted Mr. Darcy implicitly. More than that, Elizabeth admired and respected him. Thank you for agreeing to see me like this, Miss Elizabeth. You made it sound important. Indeed, it is a matter of grave importance to me. I have learned that your cousin, Mr. Collins, the heir to your father's estate no less, intends to offer you his hand in marriage. Sir, you amaze me. Pardon? I thought I knew you better than to suppose you would give credence to idle gossip. Is that all it is, Miss Elizabeth, idle gossip? To be frank, there is some basis for what you have learned. Surely it is my mother's favorite wish, for such an alliance would be the means of our family's salvation, Elizabeth replied, searching his face for some indication of how he would be affected by hearing it from her. She quickly added, I do not know that I can marry a man whom I do not honor and respect. But is he a good man? Is he honorable? Is he decent? I have no reason to assume he does not possess either of those traits. You are a wise and sensible young lady. I trust you will do what is best for yourself, for your family. Steady to his purpose, Mr. Darcy took Elizabeth by the hand. Raising it to his lips, he brushed a soft kiss across her knuckles. Not wanting to relinquish his touch, he turned it over and pressed a lingering kiss on her palm. Remembering himself, he whispered, I'm sorry, Miss Elizabeth. Pardon? I kissed your hand twice. You did indeed, Elizabeth said. I dare say you lingered a bit the second time. Lingered? He moved closer. Feeling emboldened, Darcy wanted nothing more than to brush a light kiss upon her eyelids, first one and then the other, and at length press his lips against her chin. Her lips. He did not. Were we to be caught in such a compromising position, it might very well alter the course of both our lives forever. I dare not risk it. Instead, he took her other hand in his. Do you mean like this? Once again, he pressed his lips against her palm, heedless of the passage of time. Oh, how he wanted to do more, so much more. I have no such right. Releasing her hands, he touched Elizabeth's cheek. I shall leave you, while I have the strength to do so, he silently added. Good night, Miss Elizabeth. And then he was gone. Chapter 12. The Right Thing. Darcy had not intended to leave Netherfield so soon as that next morning, yet there he sat in the carriage opposite his friend Bingley on the road to London. It was time. Those same sentiments that had compelled him to say goodbye to Elizabeth the evening before echoed in his mind. I was never meant to travel to Hertfordshire and meet and fall in love with my future bride. I came solely for the purposes of helping my friend with the management of his estate. Yet I somehow allowed myself to become distracted by Miss Elizabeth, her fine eyes, and her light and pleasing figure. As pleasing as it was to spend time with her, to what end was I doing so? To secure a lasting friendship? To dally with a young woman's affections when I have refused to behave in such a reckless manner for the greatest part of my life? She is a gentleman's daughter, and by paying so much attention to her, not only am I raising the expectations of her family and her friends, I am raising her expectation as well. Perchance our paths shall cross again, although I find that very unlikely, given the vast difference in our circumstances. I shall simply wish Miss Elizabeth well, even if I find myself doing so from afar. While Darcy would have been perfectly contented to pass the bulk of the time in silent contemplation of all that he was leaving behind, his young friend was not nearly of the same mind. Uppermost on Bingley's mind was the question of whether he was doing the right thing in leaving. Bingley, Darcy began in response to his friend's persistent need for reassurance, I will not presume to tell you what you ought to think or how you ought to feel about Miss Bennet. All I can do is share my own observations of what might be perceived as commonly held sentiments where such unequal alliances are concerned. I am all too aware of your views on this subject. The fact is, Darcy, in my belief by marrying Miss Bennet, I would indeed be marrying beyond my sphere, for she is a gentleman's daughter. While I am wealthy, and thus I enjoy many of the benefits afforded to those of status and privilege, I am not wont to forget that my family's fortune was acquired in trade. You seem to have given this matter a great deal of serious thought, my friend, yet you remain skeptical, which is precisely the reason I am seeking your counsel. I will not tell you how you ought to proceed. However, I will ask you this. Are you absolutely certain tender feelings you have for the young lady are not born out of mere infatuation? More importantly, are you certain the feelings you surmise she has for you are not a combination of infatuation and a desire for a most advantageous match with a gentleman of consequence? Bingley pursed his lips in contemplation. Seeing this, Darcy continued, Perhaps this time away is just what you need to decide what you are about. You have always found London to be quite diverting. Darcy did not know whether the words he was expressing were meant solely for his friend or rather for himself. His obligation to marry well was no less important than his friend's, after all, at least not in the eyes of society in general. An alliance between the grandson of an earl and the daughter of a country gentleman with no fortune and no connection would be considered laughable. As he was not one to be bothered by what others thought of him, Darcy knew his reservations had less to do with what society might think and more to do with his own sentiments. Try as he might, he really did not like Miss Elizabeth's relations, at least those of the female persuasion. The younger sisters might overcome their silly ways, were the elder two sisters to retain favorable alliances, but surely the mother would always be ridiculous, indeed an embarrassment. Why am I even thinking this way? It is not as though I am anyway obliged to see any of the Bennets ever again, now that I have taken my leave of Hertfordshire. True, I shall miss Elizabeth. I might spend months, if not years, wondering what might have been. At the end of the day, I must uphold my responsibility as the master of Pemberley to choose my future bride wisely. Chapter 13. An excellent point. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single woman of 27, who is perceived by society in general, as well as by herself, to be rather plain-looking, will seize upon any and every opportunity to secure a husband, even one whom others may perceive as utterly ridiculous, if it means escaping a fate of spinsterhood, forever reliant upon the generosity of family and friends. Miss Charlotte Lucas having received what she elected to consider as tacit permission from her closest friend to pursue Mr. William Collins, set off on the path to Longbourn, the neighboring village. Truth be told, Elizabeth had not exactly recommended her cousin to her friend, but instead, she had made it perfectly clear that she had no interest in the ridiculous man. Indeed, Elizabeth had stated in no uncertain terms that she would not wish for an alliance with such a ridiculous man upon her worst enemy. It would suit her just fine if the man would simply go away from Hertfordshire and never be heard from again. "Dearest Eliza," Charlotte had cried in response to Elizabeth's harsh edict, "the gentleman is the probable heir of Longbourn, your family's home. Surely that must count for something." "It counts to my mother, but as for myself, I truly do not care," her friend had declared. Elizabeth's words were Charlotte's steady companions on her way to Longbourn. Servants talked, and word had gotten out that Elizabeth had spurned Mr. Collins's offer of marriage earlier that morning, and in so doing had caused quite an uproar in the Longbourn household. Stepping up her pace, Charlotte's intentions were twofold. First, she wanted to offer comfort to her intimate friend, who would surely need it should she persist in her refusal, for Mrs. Bennet most likely would not have it any other way with the future of Longbourn, and by consequence her own lasting domestic tranquility at stake. Second of all, there were 3 other single Bennet daughters that Miss Bennet might push forth by way of a compromise to the jilted heir. 4, if one were to count the eldest, and why would one not? While it was Mrs. Bennet's favorite wish that her new neighbor, Mr. Charles Bingley, would offer his hand to her eldest daughter, Jane, he had not done so theretofore. What with his scheduled return to London, as rumor had it on business? Who was to say, with any degree of certainty, that Miss Bennet might sit and wait patiently for his return? No, Charlotte knew that if she were to stand a chance of garnering the vicar's notice, she must throw herself directly in his path. But first, she needed to see her friend to make sure that Elizabeth would stay steadfast in her determination to refuse a respectable man's offer of marriage. Charlotte did not make it so far as the manor house. As fate would have it, she espied a somewhat distraught Mr. Collins just up ahead in the lane. His head was held low. Indeed, Charlotte could honestly say she had never seen the proud man appear so forsaken. "Good afternoon, sir," said Charlotte, curtsying when they were face to face. "Oh, Miss Lucas, it is a pleasure to see you," said he in return. "Sir, if you do not mind my saying so, you do not look quite like yourself. Is there anything wrong?" Charlotte asked. "How observant of you to notice. I am not quite myself. Indeed, you are very perceptive. I fear there's a grave matter of concern weighing heavily on my mind, but I do not think it is a matter that I ought to be discussing with anyone. Will you forgive me?" "Indeed, I do understand your reluctance to talk about what is troubling you. I understand perfectly well. You and I hardly know each other. However, I assure you that I am a willing listener upon whose confidence you may rely. I dare say it might help." Shaking his head, the vicar persisted in his desire to keep his own counsel, which only encouraged Charlotte more. At length, her own determination won out, and Mr. Collins began his speech. He spoke, and Charlotte grew to suspect he would not cease talking any time soon. Not that it bothered her one bit, for she was nothing if not a patient woman. When at last she sensed a lull in the Anguish parson's discourse, Charlotte seized upon her chance to say something. "I do not envy you your plight one bit, sir. Would that I could do anything to lessen your burden." "You have done so much already, Miss Lucas, merely by hearing what I have said. I dare not impose upon your kindness more than I already have." "It is no imposition at all, Mr. Collins. If there is any other way that I can be of assistance to you in this unpleasant business, pray do not hesitate to let me know. I am at your service." He seemed on the verge of saying something. Charlotte leaned forward encouragingly. "I hope you know by now that you have my complete confidence," she uttered. "There is the matter of my noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh's disappointed hopes. She sent me to Longbourn with the express purpose of choosing a wife from among my fair cousins. Having failed to persuade Cousin Elizabeth to accept my hand, do I dare give up hope, or do I offer my hand in marriage to one of the others?" Charlotte paused a moment or two to show him just how much she was contemplating the import of this particular dilemma, as well as her own response. "Pray do not keep me in suspense, Miss Lucas. You have been so generous to me thus far. Surely you have an opinion on what I ought to do." "Sir," Charlotte subsequently began, "I dare say there are few people in all of England, nay, the entire world, who know and understand Lady Catherine de Bourgh's temperament so well as you. Pray, how do you suppose she would react if you were to choose from among your younger cousins? You know Mrs. Bennet too well to suppose she would not put forth her youngest daughter, Miss Lydia, as a prospective bride. Miss Lydia is her favorite after all." Just the mention of that young girl's name evoked an unsettling turn in Mr. Collins's countenance, giving Charlotte to know the gentleman was not nearly so obtuse as her friend Elizabeth had suggested. Charlotte went on to say, "Having spent so much time as you have as a guest in your future home, you cannot have missed how close Miss Lydia and her sister Miss Kitty are to each other. Why, they are as close as two peas in a pod. If you should marry either, you shall no doubt find yourself providing for the other under your roof. No doubt you have had occasion to hear their excellent father, Mr. Bennet, refer to them as two of the silliest girls in England. How do you suppose your noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, would abide their presence? If she is half as discerning as I suspect, and what grand dame would not be, I fear she would grow weary of them in no time at all, banishing the two of them, and by extension, you from her sight. Have I not heard you speak of what great pleasure you derive from being such a frequent guest at Rosings? Indeed, I believe I've heard you speak about that very subject with alacrity." By now, Charlotte had silently coaxed the gentleman to take his place by her side and commenced walking with her along the path to Lucas Lodge. "You have made an excellent point, Miss Lucas." "I only mean to help, sir, which brings me to Miss Mary, who is next in age to your true choice, Miss Eliza." Mr. Collins nodded knowingly. "Yes, I have detected that my fair cousin, Miss Mary, is a particularly sensible young woman." Charlotte shrugged a little. "True, she is rather more sensible than the younger two siblings. Some may even refer to her as rather pious, everything a parson's wife ought to be. But then again, you are not just any parson, are you, sir? You can rightfully boast of being one of the most fortunate clergymen in all of England, having been bestowed one of the most highly desired livings in the land. Were it not for a simple point of contention, I would recommend Miss Mary without reservations." Her walking companion arched his brow. "Pray, what is that, Miss Lucas, if you do not mind my asking?" "Well, sir, I do not like to speak out of turn, but you did witness Miss Mary's exhibition at the Netherfield ball, did you not? Did you not observe the particularly cruel manner of her reception? I am not saying that I share in the opinions of most of those in attendance, even her own father. But how do you suppose Lady Catherine de Bourgh might react? Is she not accustomed to being regaled by the finest performances in all of England? Would she not insist on hearing your wife exhibit whenever the two of you visit Rosings? Again, you would not wish to give her ladyship cause to reconsider your standing as a most sought-after guest for dinner or tea. Again, you make an excellent point, Miss Lucas. I suppose that only leaves Cousin Jane, although Lady Catherine did specifically mention that the eldest daughter was not the ideal choice for me." "Why ever not?" Charlotte asked, in the wake of this new information. "Owing to the possibility of an alliance with Mr. Charles Bingley, although, if the gentleman truly intended to make my cousin an offer of marriage, what has prevented him from doing so thus far? There does appear to be a fair measure of affection between the two of them." "I agree, which is even more of a reason that Jane should not be a potential candidate, unless the possibility of a second refusal from a Bennet daughter is something you are willing to risk." In the next breath, Charlotte exclaimed, "Oh, look! Lucas Lodge is just up ahead. I would be terribly remiss were I to fail to invite you to join us for a family dinner. My father and mother, Sir William, and Lady Lucas would never forgive me for such a lapse in proper decorum and civility. Oh, do say you accept my invitation. I assure you that you will be received with all the deference a man of your standing in society and the world in general demands." Later that day, Charlotte and Mr. Collins found themselves retracing their steps in the direction of Longbourn village. "Miss Lucas, I cannot tell you what an enlightening experience it has been speaking with you today. Indeed, for I have come to consider that there is another option. True, my noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, sent me here with the express purpose of offering my hand in marriage to one of my fair cousins, but I see no reason why I should completely fail in my mission to find a wife. Thinking her efforts to cajole, sympathize, and indeed patronize had been in vain, Charlotte leaned in closer and tilted her head coquettishly. What exactly are you saying, Mr. Collins? I flatter myself into the belief that I can and I will be just as happy in marriage with another young woman as I might have been with my cousin Elizabeth. Oh, Mr. Collins, I do not know quite what to say. Of course I accept your offer of marriage. I shall be honored to be your wife. The gentleman's countenance spoke to his amazement. I beg your pardon? I accept your offer of marriage. When shall we speak to my father? No doubt you will want to do so as soon as can be. The sooner you speak to my father, the sooner the banns can be read. The sooner we shall be married, and the sooner I shall have the pleasure of traveling with you to Kent, where I shall be most honored to ingratiate myself with your noble patroness, the estimable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and the sooner I shall commence my duties as your wife, the mistress of your home. The befuddled vicar said. You need not worry about my father's reaction to your proposal, for I assure you he will give us his blessing with severe alacrity, as will my mother, to be sure. And if you are concerned about Mrs. Bennet's reaction, then you need not give it another thought. I shall be more than happy to go to Longbourn village to convey my happy news to all my friends. In fact, what say you return to Longbourn and gather all your things so that you might be my family's guest at Lucas Lodge for the remainder of your stay in Hertfordshire? Linking her arms to her future husband's, Charlotte coaxed him along the path. Oh, what a happy life we shall have. Do you not agree? Miss Charlotte Lucas did not know whether to be pleased with herself or appalled. All she knew was that she had set out to land a husband, and she had accomplished her goal most expeditiously, with hardly any trouble at all to herself. As I think about it, is there really any reason to do anything other than congratulate myself? It is not as though I lied or practiced any sort of subterfuge. I did not have to resort to the strategic employment of my feminine arts and allurements. I merely confirmed that which the gentleman was already thinking. Better than that, I saved him the trouble of explaining his change of heart about offering his hand to one of his fair cousins, to Mrs. Bennet, who, no doubt, will be livid. Charlotte could not help smiling just a little bit over what her neighbor's reaction would be. As much as I adore my dearest friend Eliza, I cannot honestly say that her mother is one of my favorites, not after the manner in which she has dismissed and disparaged me as being unattractive and unworthy. Charlotte chuckled. How ironic, how fitting that I shall be the one who has the last laugh. To think I shall one day bear the title which Mrs. Bennet covets as though it were a crowning jewel. I shall be the next mistress of Longbourn. Not that Charlotte relished the idea of how that might be brought about. She was not entirely insensitive to what her future marital felicity meant to the ladies of Longbourn village. At least one part of Miss Bennet's worst nightmares, in the event of Mr. Bennet's passing, shall never come to pass, Charlotte considered. The Bennets will not be thrown into the hedgerows so long as I can help it. Satisfied that, on the whole, the Bennet women would have no actual cause to repine, Charlotte smiled deep down inside. All in all, I do believe everything will unfold precisely as it was meant to be. Chapter 14. Happy Occasion. Birds chirped in the trees, the amazing autumn colors all abound. What a perfect morning for a walk. Good morning, Charlotte, Elizabeth said, cheerily approaching her intimate friend. Charlotte smiled brightly. Why, Eliza, what a happy coincidence this is, meeting you like this. I was just on my way to Longbourn village to see you. This is a coincidence indeed, for I was just on my way to see you. I need to tell you something. Oh, pray allow me to tell you my happy news first. As my dearest friend, I am hoping you will be the first person outside of my family to wish me joy. To wish you joy? Pray, what is the happy occasion? Wait, allow me to guess. You are going to visit your relations in Bath. I know how much you have been looking forward to seeing them. No, it is not that. However, I will be going on a journey in the near future. That is to say, as soon as the bonds are read. Charlotte, what are you saying? I am getting married, Charlotte exclaimed with energy. Married? Elizabeth cried, her voice speaking to her astonishment. You need not sound so shocked. But to whom? When? Where? Do I know the gentleman? It is Mr. Collins, Charlotte replied. I am marrying Mr. Collins. Our Mr. Collins? Yes, your cousin, Mr. Collins. But Charlotte, the man is preposterous. Charlotte shrugged. That may very well be your opinion. I choose to disagree. Then perhaps you do not know the man so well as you think, if you suppose he is not. He is a decent and honorable man, Charlotte posited. He is ridiculous, puffed up with pride. For the sake of our friendship, the two of us ought to agree to disagree. But Charlotte, I know that you are a practical woman. You no doubt view this as a chance to leave your father's home, believing as you do that you are a burden to him. But what about your future happiness? Well, there is no reason to suppose that I would not be just as happy with Mr. Collins as I would with any other. I have long believed that happiness in marriage is a matter of choice. Charlotte, I do not know what to say. Say that you are happy for me. Say that you wish me joy. After an awkward pause, two lifelong friends gently embraced. Nodding, a lone tear escaped Elizabeth's eye and trickled slowly down her face. Though the precise words remained unspoken, the sentiment was clear. Their lives would never be the same. Chapter 15. Unenviable Position. Elizabeth and her sister Jane had endured quite a lot over the span of a week. It seemed that things simply fell apart all of a sudden, starting with the morning after the Netherfield ball. Looking back, Elizabeth wondered what, if anything, might have been done differently that they might not find themselves in such unenviable positions. Jane suffering a broken heart owing to her lover's failure to return to Hertfordshire when he had promised he would, and Elizabeth suffering the wrath of her mother and possibly the censure of her neighbors for having spurned an offer of marriage from the heir of her father's estate. She knew from the start that the reason for Mr. Collins's visit was to make up for the unfortunate terms of the entail by offering his aunt in marriage to one of the Bennet daughters. She had ample reason to suspect that, indeed, she was the Bennet daughter of his choice. Despite all of that, she had done nothing to dissuade him from his ill-conceived course. That is to say, nothing other than endeavor as best as I could to ignore him. Perhaps if she had tried, she might have redirected his attention to her sister Mary, whom Elizabeth suspected would have liked very much to be the object of his desire. Oh, but how could I, when I would not wish for an alliance with such a ridiculous man on my worst enemy? Certainly not my own sister, or anyone else that I genuinely care about. Said conviction made his subsequent proposal to her intimate friend Charlotte Lucas and her friend's eager acceptance all the more troubling for Elizabeth. I have always known Charlotte to be a practical sort of creature, but I never supposed she was desperate. Elizabeth sighed. Granted, I do not know when I have seen Charlotte so happy as she is of late. I shall try my best to be happy for her as well, although I do not know how convincing I will be. The man is ridiculous. Elizabeth glanced over at her sister, who was fast asleep owing to the early morning hour. And my dearest Jane, I do not know when I have ever seen her so forlorn. No one was more convinced than I was that Mr. Bingley loved her, and that he was going to make her an offer of marriage. Of course, no one other than Mamma had the gall to boast of it out loud during supper time at the Netherfield ball. Elizabeth shivered a little in recollection of her mother's crass words. I expect that Jane shall be married to Mr. Bingley. Oh, he is such a charming young man, and so rich, and living but 3 miles from Longbourn. To make matters worse, she had the audacity to speak in such a manner in the presence of Mr. Bingley's sisters. No doubt they were instrumental in persuading their brother to stay away from Hertfordshire, believing my mother is mercenary, and by extension, Jane too. On the other hand, Mr. Bingley is a grown man, responsible for making his own decisions. If he really and truly wanted to return, then nothing and no one would be able to stop him. Not even his pernicious sisters, Louisa Hurst and Caroline Bingley. Indeed, a man in love would not be so easily persuaded to stay away from the woman he loves, which forces me to consider what Jane has already accepted. He never really loved her at all. As much as it pained Elizabeth to think such thoughts, what choice did she have? Why, Bingley himself admitted to his capricious nature as a means of boasting, no less. If he is genuinely as fickle as all that, I must ask myself why I would even wish for his eventual return. Despite the increasing tumult of her mind, at an hour of the morning when all she wanted to do was return to sleep, the question would not remain unanswered. Why? Because my sister Jane, despite her words to the contrary, loves him very much. Indeed, I have never seen her so much in love, and I would give anything in the world to see the smile return to her face. Chapter 16. Any Means Necessary. Word of Mr. Collins's failure to secure Miss Elizabeth Bennet's hand reached Lady Catherine de Bourgh rather swiftly. She had her informant to thank for that. Just one of several trusted cohorts who had been so instrumental in apprising her of her nephew Darcy's questionable behavior since his early autumn arrival in Hertfordshire, and Mr. Thomas Teller. Upon learning of the vicar's alternative conquests, the hand of a country nothing by the name of Miss Charlotte Lucas, her ladyship decried. There is nothing to be done. It appears this Miss Elizabeth Bennet is more of a force to be dealt with than I had supposed. I have another rather disturbing matter to advise you of, your ladyship, pertaining to Miss Elizabeth Bennet and your nephew, Mr. Darcy, Mr. Teller advised. Well, go on. Do not keep me in suspense, Lady Catherine demanded. While attending the recent ball at his friend Charles Bingley's Netherfield estate, your nephew did not dance with any young lady in attendance other than Miss Elizabeth Bennet. The grand lady's annoyance steadily increasing by the second, she cried, Do you mean to tell me that he purposely singled her out? His manner serious, albeit humble, Teller replied. He did indeed, much to the amazement of everyone in the room. I know my nephew well enough to know he would never have behaved in such a manner as to give rise to an expectation of something more tangible. No doubt that is the reason that Miss Elizabeth Bennet refused the hand of a perfectly decent man. She has her eye on a far grander prize, my nephew. I shall not abide it. Lady Catherine sprang from her chair in an aristocratic huff. She commenced pacing the floor. I know that my nephew has since left Hertfordshire, but if what I suspect is true, he may very well plan to return to that wretched place. What a travesty that would be. She tapped her finger on her chin. Even the slightest possibility that the country upstart posed a threat to her daughter's future as the next mistress of Pemberley was not something to be taken lightly. At length, she returned her attention to Teller, who was, no doubt, impatient for further employment. Did I hear you say, the last time we spoke, that George Wickham, my late brother-in-law's despicable godson, is also in Hertfordshire, and that he is a favorite among the Bennet daughters? Lady Catherine asked. Teller nodded. I did indeed. However, he was not in attendance at the ball. I understand he was called away on business in town. Excellent. You must return to Hertfordshire right away. Find that vile man, and persuade him to pursue Miss Elizabeth Bennet, to make her fall in love with him, and marry him. He pursed his lips. That might prove to be a tall order, your ladyship. To what lengths do you propose I go to persuade the gentleman to see things your way? Her ladyship waved her hand dismissively, knowing all too well that men of George Wickham's ilk were always desperately in want of funds, she declared. Use any means necessary. Make that gentleman an offer he cannot possibly refuse. Chapter 17. Means of Uniting. Some days later, the sound of the household servants going about their early morning routines aroused Elizabeth from her slumber. She had overslept again. She might easily have blamed her lack of urgency to commence her day to the downpour that had started at some point in the wee hours and had not let up. But in this case, the weather had nothing to do with it. A part of her felt strongly that her tendency to do so of late was in some way by choice. Each night since the Netherfield ball, she dreamed of but one thing, time spent with Mr. Darcy, unfinished dreams. If I could but finish my dreams, I do believe therein would be the answer to my nagging questions. She sat up in bed and cradled her knees to her chest. Lizzie, said Jane, who lay next to her. I am sorry, Jane. Did I awaken you? No, I have been lying here for some time. You were sleeping so peacefully, finally. I did not wish to risk disturbing your slumber. What do you mean? Sitting up enough to rest her head on her hand, Jane said, You tossed and turned throughout the night. It was almost as though you were reliving Mr. Collins's proposal. Elizabeth laughed a little at this idea before apologizing. Oh, do not apologize. I only imagine what manner of dreams our dear Charlotte is suffering. Jane, what an uncharitable speech. uncharitable indeed, for this was Jane, who believed all the world was kind and good, who never had an unkind thing to say about anybody. But Jane had spoken in such an unflattering manner more than once of late, and Elizabeth could only suppose it was for reasons closely akin to the subject of Elizabeth's dreams. Jane had undergone a transformation, the timing of which was closely aligned with the receipt of that horrible letter from Caroline Bingley stating that her brother, Charles, had no intention of returning to Hertfordshire in the foreseeable future. It was a letter intended for Jane, but Elizabeth had read its contents enough to commit parts of it to memory, and though she scarcely believed a word of it, its effect on Jane was undoubtedly all that Miss Bingley had intended, for Jane had thereupon proceeded to lose all hope. "Pray forgive me, Lizzie. I do not know what is happening to me of late. Do you not, dearest? Oh, Lizzie, I would rather do anything but speak of Mr. Bingley's defection, as our mother is wont to describe his return to London. I am afraid I must. You know I do not believe a word of his sister's letter. And yet he has not returned, just as she foretold." Elizabeth watched the raindrops trace a crooked path down the window pane. "And thus my conundrum. Mr. Bingley loves you. His affection for you was plain for all to see. Does he really, Lizzie? I know he paid a great deal more attention to me than any other young woman of our acquaintance. Cannot be the same said of Mr. Darcy's attentions toward you? And yet you will not allow that he was in love with you. How are our situations different?" Elizabeth bit her lower lip. She would be lying if she denied asking herself the same question time and time again, but never out loud. She argued with herself that Mr. Darcy never looked at her the way she observed Bingley looking at Jane. But he did. He was always looking at her. She wanted to argue that her heart never skipped a beat in the wake of Mr. Darcy's smile in that same manner in which Bingley's smiles affected her sister. But how could she know what Jane felt? Jane never shows her true feelings to anyone. Besides, Elizabeth's heart did not merely skip a beat in Mr. Darcy's smile. It leaped. "But I never loved Mr. Darcy. He never loved me. I know he liked me just as much as I liked him." Elizabeth blew out a quiet breath and lowered herself back in bed. She cupped her hands behind her head. "Liking is not loving," she whispered. "I beg your pardon," Jane said. "I would like to believe that I know a man in love when I see one." Jane sat up and lowered her feet to the floor, prompting her sister to sit up once more. "I pray you have given strong consideration to the idea of returning to town with our aunt and uncle after Christmas. Once Mr. Bingley learns of your presence in town, he will come to you. Of that I have little doubt." Jane sighed. "I wish I had your confidence." "You do not need confidence. You only need the means of reuniting with the gentleman. Your odds of doing so are far greater in London than here in Hertfordshire. Of that there can be no dissenting opinions." Chapter 18. An Exemplary Man. Out came the sun that morning, warming the late autumn air and reawakening in Elizabeth her desire for a long, solitary stroll to Oakham Mount. It had been so long since she ventured that way on her own. In some small way, it comforted her to remember what it had been like to visit the place with Mr. Darcy and see it through his eyes. Even now, despite her talk with Jane, and indeed lingering unanswered questions only raised inside her dreams, she had not taught herself to view Mr. Darcy's leave-taking in the same light as she regarded Mr. Bingley's. The departure of the latter had left her dearest sister heartbroken, whereas the departure of the former was something she knew would one day happen. She simply had not expected it to be so soon. The latter was a defection, evidence of a lack of constancy, plain and simple. The former was an inevitability, bound to happen. Wishing in vain that said inevitability had occurred later, much later, so that she might have continued to bask in its handsome smell for a while longer, Elizabeth sighed. "Our time together was wonderful while it lasted. I must content myself with that." While on her way back to Longbourn a short while later, Elizabeth espied a gentleman in a red coat who appeared to be waiting for her in the lane just up ahead. As she drew closer, she recognized the gentleman as Lieutenant George Wickham, the charming officer in the militia encamped just outside of Meryton. She had met him many times before, although never in such circumstances as this, and knowing him to be such a favorite of her two younger sisters, she supposed he was on his way to Longbourn village to call on them. She was not wrong in her assumption, as she came to know soon after reaching his side and exchanging greetings with him in accordance with the usual civilities. "Shall we walk together?" Lieutenant George Wickham asked, extending his arm to her as a gentlemanly courtesy. Ignoring his gallantry, even as she proceeded to walk alongside him, Elizabeth said, "My sisters were very disappointed that you were unable to attend the Netherfield ball, sir." "Were you disappointed as well, Miss Elizabeth?" The tone of his voice made her just a little uneasy, for she supposed the gentleman was flirting with her. What else could it be? For they barely knew each other. The last thing she needed was for Kitty and Lydia, or whichever of the two who fancied the gentleman as a favorite beau, to view her as a competitor for the officer's attention. Although he is exceedingly handsome, Elizabeth considered in the next breath, almost, if not more so, than Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth replied, "You may certainly infer as much if that is your wish. Pray, what kept you away?" "In this case it is not what kept me away, but who." "Who might have prevented you from attending the ball? Many of the officers from the militia were present." "It was Fitzwilliam Darcy," said Wickham, speaking in a matter-of-fact tone. Just the mention of his name caused a fluttering in her stomach. She surely did not intend to let her walking companion know that. He continued, "Indeed, despite his friend's invitation, it was made perfectly clear to me that Darcy was a most esteemed guest at Netherfield. I had no wish to attend merely for the purposes of being ostracized." "I am certain that Mr. Darcy would never behave in such a fashion as you suggest." "If you believe that is true, then I posit that you do not know him so well as you think you do." "Pardon my asking, sir, but what is the reason for your apparent disdain for Mr. Darcy? For I know him to be an exemplary man." "In 3 words, he hates me. He always has. I cannot name the precise moment or the spot in which it became apparent to me just how much he despises me. But if I were forced to try, I would say it started when we went off to university, for it was then that he began to see just how much his excellent father, the late Mr. Darcy, loved me. He was my godfather, and he treated me with such prodigious care. Darcy, being the selfish man that he has always been, could not stand it." Elizabeth did not know what to think when hearing a man whom she had come to admire being spoken of so disparagingly. Not knowing how to look or how to feel, her mind then escaped to the day in Meryton when she first made George Wickham's acquaintance, and utter disgust on Mr. Darcy's face, and having observed it, Wickham must have noticed her increasing unrest. "Forgive me if what I have said has caused you any discomfort. I know how much you liked him. Unless I am mistaken, you did not always feel that way." "What do you mean?" Elizabeth asked. "From what I am told, you once hated the man. I was told he declared you merely tolerable and not handsome enough to tempt him, not even enough to stand opposite him on the dance floor." Once again, Elizabeth found herself wishing that her former opinions of Mr. Darcy, whom she now regarded as one of the best men she knew, had been more moderate, her criticisms less severe. Her change in sentiment was not something she wished to discuss with the gentleman walking along beside her, however. "Perhaps you ought not to listen to idle gossip," she said, owing to the timing of Wickham's arrival in the vicinity in comparison to the date of the Meryton assembly to which he had alluded. "Even when the source of my information was your own sister?" he responded. "My sister?" He nodded. "Your youngest, Miss Lydia," she scoffed. "Especially if your source of information is my sister Lydia," she declared, half joking, half serious. "I shall consider myself forewarned." After a pause, he said, "However, if the words attributed to my friend were indeed uttered by him, it would not surprise me one bit. It is just the sort of thing he would say. He has little regard for the feelings of those whom he perceives as beneath him in consequence. I know him well enough to know he very well felt that way about everyone in the vicinity. He is very proud indeed. His pride never deserts him. However, with the rich, he is liberal-minded, just, sincere, rational, honorable, and perhaps agreeable, allowing something for fortune and figure." Against her will, Elizabeth could not help but listen to the things George Wickham was saying, for, other than the Bingleys, he was the only person in the world whom she knew could claim an acquaintance with Fitzwilliam Darcy. It was not as though she had not suspected the shade in his character in the very beginning of their own acquaintance. Continuing his speech, Wickham said, "I suppose he has every right to be proud. He is wealthy beyond compare, and his fortune will soon be even greater with the combining of his estate and that of his noble aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh." "Do you mean to suggest that Mr. Darcy is his aunt's sole heir, that her health is failing? I was given to believe she has a daughter, a Miss Anne de Bourgh." "Then you have heard of Mr. de Bourgh?" "Indeed, my cousin, Mr. Collins, is Lady Catherine de Bourgh's patron, and she is his savior, if you can believe his account of things. He speaks very highly of Miss de Bourgh. I believe he described her as a most charming young lady indeed. He even went so far as to parrot Lady Catherine herself, espousing that, in point of true beauty, Miss de Bourgh is far superior to the handsomest of her sex, for there is that in her features which marks the young lady of distinguished birth. Here Elizabeth shrugged, or words to that effect. Then he would have spoken of her engagement. No, he did not. The import of Wickham's earlier words struck Elizabeth like light. She nearly gasped. "Are you saying that Miss Anne de Bourgh is engaged to marry—" Wickham nodded. None other than the proud and haughty man himself, Fitzwilliam Darcy. Now she really was confounded, and she made no attempt to hide her dismay. "You look astounded, Miss Elizabeth. You look as though this is the first indication you have of any of the things I am telling you. Surely Darcy would have given you his own account of the things I have said." "No, sir, he did not. In fact, Mr. Darcy and I have never discussed you at all," she lied. Such a deflection was absolutely necessary to see an end to the conversation, she supposed. They were not very far from the house, and thus she hastened her pace considerably. She could hardly wait for her sisters to take the lieutenant off her hands, so that she might dwell upon those matters the two of them had discussed at her leisure, even though she was sure nothing good would come of it. "How on earth could Mr. Darcy possibly have neglected to inform me that he is engaged to be married to his cousin?" Once alone in her room, Elizabeth's mind was in a tumult. Mr. Darcy engaged to be married? How can it possibly be true? How could he have spent all of this time in Hertfordshire as he did, and not mentioned a single word of this to anyone? Is this a well-kept secret, known only to those who are closest to him? Do the Bingleys know? Does Miss Caroline Bingley know? She paced the floor. No, she does not know, because it is not true. What manner of young woman would deliberately pursue a man whom she knows to be pledged to another? Elizabeth stopped in the middle of the room. What if it is true? What if Mr. Darcy is engaged to his cousin? Now she really was concerned. At length she was able to find comfort in one thought, for how contented she was now realizing that her heart had never been touched by this man. How heartbroken she might now be had that been the case. Elizabeth cupped her hands over her face. So many conflicting thoughts raced through her busy mind. So many questions, and alas, the biggest one of all. Why does the thought of a gentleman whom I may never meet again marrying another hurt so much? Chapter 19. Matter of Temperament. Darcy House, London. Darcy sat by the fireplace in his study, nursing his drink, alone. He had been invited to dine with Mr. and Mrs. Hurst any number of times since their return to town. However, he always made some excuse or another to avoid accepting. Besides, he was friends with Charles Bingley, not the young man's entire family, and never was that point driven home so completely than when they were all in residence together at Netherfield. True, the Bingleys had enjoyed the hospitality of Pemberley a number of times, but that was different. When at Pemberley, Darcy always had a convenient excuse of needing to attend estate business when Miss Caroline Bingley's company became too much to bear. He had no such excuses while at Netherfield. For a while, he found sanctuary in Bingley's library, but as sparse as his friend's library was, there was little to divert Darcy. The memory of spending time alone with Miss Elizabeth Bennet in the library at Netherfield sprang to his mind, as it often did whenever he thought of books. He could spend hours at a time simply being in her company, even if they did not exchange a single word between them, which, as he recalled, infrequently did occur. On so many occasions, he was content to admire her, her light and pleasing figure, the teasing turn of her lips, as she was wont to do from time to time, and her easy, playful manners. How I missed her. Darcy left Hertfordshire because he was not prepared to offer for Elizabeth. Not that he had even contemplated it, at least not seriously. It was a matter of temperament. His friend Bingley, whom most might have described as impetuous, could embark upon such a path of falling in love at the drop of a hat, and society would not bat a single eye. But Darcy was older, and consequently wiser, more settled, and more importantly, more disciplined. He had obligations and responsibilities that eclipsed those of his young friend, who was still coming into his own. The master of Pemberley, who held the power to decide the livelihoods of so many, did not simply offer his hand in marriage to the first woman who captured his fancy, even though she had bewitched him like no other woman before. Perhaps if he'd had more time, but that particular factor had been taken away with the arrival of the future heir of Longbourn, who was ready and willing to make the young lady an offer of marriage. By what right did he have to impede the certainty of such an advantageous prospect with only a hint of a promise of something more at some unspecified future moment in time? There is nothing to be done about it. I was right to leave Hertfordshire when I did. If he never laid eyes on her again, it might undoubtedly pain him and cause a part of him to wonder still. But at the end of the day, he would remember that he had done the right thing. A part of him could not help thinking such a line of thought was in vain. If Miss Elizabeth had done what was expected of her, and what was in the best interest of all her family, and had indeed married her cousin Mr. William Collins, then Darcy, in all likelihood, would never see her again, except for one thing. Mr. William Collins, after all, resides at the parsonage in Huntford. Indeed, his home abuts my Aunt Lady Catherine's estate. Darcy always visited his aunt at Easter, and that year would be no exception. Not only did his aunt depend on the visit, but his cousin Anne depended on it as well. Despite their general expectation that on one such trip Darcy might finally offer his hand in marriage to Anne, something he would never ever do, he looked forward to the annual visit as well. He loved his aunt. He loved his cousin Anne too. Only he did not love her in the way a man loves a woman whom he takes as a wife. He would be lying if he did suggest that the thought of disappointing his cousin Anne's hopes once again did not pain him. But what was he to do? I know exactly what I must do. Is there no wonder my protests against the scheme fall on deaf ears when discussing the matter with my aunt? It is cousin Anne to whom I must make this confession. That is precisely what I shall do when I see her again in Kent. Chapter 20. Her Expectations. Miss Caroline Bingley rushed into the drawing where her sister Louisa sat attending her needlecraft, and Louisa's husband and Caroline's brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, lay asleep on the sofa. "Louisa, my dear," cried Caroline, "you will never guess what news from Hertfordshire." "Dear sister, if you do not mind my saying, you certainly entertain a keen interest in that part of the world from which you were so eager to escape. Then I take it from your response that you are not interested in my news?" "Oh, I never said that." Louisa placed her needlework aside, thus giving her sister her full attention. "Pray, what have you heard?" "Well, it seems there was a wedding. However, it is not the wedding that we had taught ourselves to hope for you do remember a wedding between Miss Elizabeth Bennet and that ridiculous cousin of hers, Mr. Collins. However, if I am to believe what is being said, the gentleman did offer his hand in marriage to Elizabeth Bennet, but she had the audacity to turn him down. Imagine that! A lowly country gentleman's daughter, with no wealth and no connections to speak of, and absolutely nothing to recommend herself to a gentleman of consequence, fancied herself too good to marry the heir of her own father's estate. What must she be thinking? Caroline's mouth gaped. "You do not think that impertinent little country nothing thinks." Impatient to hear where her sister's thought tended, Louisa cried, "Pray, go on." "I do not dare say the words out loud, for fear of the remote possibility that they may indeed unfold. Since when does say anything make said thing come true? Stranger things are known to have happened. I would not wish to tempt fate." "Well, you need not say a word, for I already begin to suspect what you are about." "I suppose you think you know me so well. I believe I know you better than anyone on earth, almost so well as you know yourself. Well, if you indeed know me so well, then you must tell me what I was about to say. It is simple. You are afraid that Miss Elizabeth spurned her cousin's hand in marriage because she believes there is a possibility that your Mr. Darcy will return to Hertfordshire, riding his great white horse like a knight in shining armor, to marry her and whisk her off to Pemberley." "Heaven forbid!" Caroline cried. "But she cannot be too pleased with the manner of his leave-taking. Even you espied how intimate the two of them were. Why, Mr. Darcy did not dance with any other woman at the ball other than Elizabeth Bennet, slighting you and me both. Surely that alone was enough to increase her expectations." "Indeed, but his attention towards her at the ball did not prevent him from joining our brother Charles when he took his leave from Netherfield the next day, and it most certainly has not compelled him to return. Mr. Darcy knows his own mind. He follows his own counsel. If he were the least bit inclined to return to Hertfordshire to rescue fair Lady Miss Elizabeth Bennet, then surely he would have done so by now." Her sister's words were just what Caroline needed to hear. She smiled. "Of course, you are correct. Hertfordshire is the last place on earth Mr. Darcy would wish to be. His every action confirms it." She stood to quit the room. Louisa said, "Are you not forgetting something, dear sister?" Caroline glanced at the spot on the sofa she had just vacated. "I do not think so." "I believe you were about to tell me about a recent wedding in Hertfordshire. Pray, who is the lucky bride?" "Oh, it is Charlotte, Sir William Lucas's eldest daughter. You do remember her." "Indeed, but is she not advancing in age? At least 27, if I recall correctly. She is rather old to be a bride. Pray, what courageous and generous gentleman decided to save her from the wretched throes of spinsterhood?" "None other than Mr. William Collins," replied Miss Caroline Bingley. "Mr. Collins? But did you not say that he offered his hand in marriage to Miss Elizabeth?" "Indeed, I did. However, having traveled so far to secure the hand of his cousin and being soundly rejected, or so I am told, I suppose he did not want to return home empty-handed." Chapter 21. Threadbare Topics. Elizabeth was not surprised upon espying the tall, handsome Lieutenant George Wickham just up ahead in the lane. Such occasions were occurring more and more frequently of late. He would always turn and accompany her back to Longbourn Village. Not that she minded one bit. He was charming, and he spoke with a great deal of intelligence, and in a manner that would render even the most threadbare topics as engaging. Of course, there were times when he seemed only interested in speaking of her friend Charlotte's recent marriage. That particular morning was one such time. Elizabeth, as always, wanted nothing to do with such talk. Endeavoring to put an end to it, she said, "Pardon me, sir, but you appear to take an eager interest in my friend's marriage to my cousin." "I can understand why you feel that way, but allow me to assure you that in speaking of the Collinses, I believe my principal interest lies primarily with you." "Me?" Elizabeth exclaimed with energy. "Indeed, it is my way of sketching your character, at least as regards the institution of marriage." "But surely, if there is something you wish to know, then you might ask me directly. Talk of the Collins is hardly required before broaching such a subject. I do know other married couples." "Your point is well taken, Miss Elizabeth." "What is it that you wish to find out about my views on marriage?" "Well, Miss Elizabeth, are you opposed to the idea of marriage in general, or do you, like so many other young ladies, consider it the crowning achievement of a woman's life?" Elizabeth was walking alongside the gentleman, and owing to his height, she did not suffer the most helpful vantage point from which to gauge his countenance. What an impertinent question, coming from someone so little connected to her. He must have sensed her ill ease. "You did give me permission to be direct, did you not?" Yes, of course I did. However, you presume too much in merely asking such a question. It is true that I had no wish to marry my cousin. Had you the privilege of making his acquaintance, then you would know the reason I was adamantly opposed to such an alliance. It is not so much that I did not like him. I can honestly say I do not totally dislike him. However, I did not respect him, and I know myself too well to even contemplate marrying a man whom I cannot respect. To do so would subject me to misery of the acutest kind. Neither my cousin nor I would have been happy in such a situation. I am sure we can agree that at least one of the people who find themselves bound together for all eternity ought to be happy." "Oh, at least one," said Lieutenant Wickham, in a manner rising to playfulness. "Preferably both, no doubt, but certainly at least one." "I am happy to know that we are of the same opinion," said Elizabeth in a similar tone. For the first time in their acquaintance, she was tempted to close some of the distance she liked to maintain between the two of them when they were walking side by side, but she thought better of it. They were not too far from Longbourn Village, and she did not want to chance being seen in such an intimate manner with her younger sister's favorite. Soon enough, she and the lieutenant would be entering the manor house, whereupon her youngest sisters would seize the gentleman by either of his arms and take him off Elizabeth's hand. That was to say nothing of how her mother would receive him. She seemed just as giddy as Kitty and Lydia when in the dashing lieutenant's presence. "I should like to think the two of us have a great deal in common, Miss Elizabeth." She said nothing, which must undoubtedly have obliged him to continue his speech. "You and I are exceedingly pleasing to look at, even if I must say so myself." Again, Elizabeth said nothing. What could she say? He knew he was handsome. Everybody knew. She dared not speak about her own beauty. Wickham continued, "We are both amiable and warm-hearted, and we fall readily into conversation with everyone we meet. With such happy manners as ours, we are sure to make friends wherever we go. Add to that, we possess a healthy degree of mutual admiration and respect for each other. And what could be more important than that? Here, the gentleman ceased his steps, prompting Elizabeth to do likewise. He turned and faced her directly. I suppose what I am saying is, whenever I contemplate my future life and the person with whom I wish to share it, but one person comes to mind. That person is you, Miss Elizabeth. Will you, please do me the honor of accepting my hand in marriage? By now, Elizabeth was utterly stunned. Without even thinking of the prospect of a life with such a man, all she could contemplate was the fact that she had now received 2 proposals of marriage, and neither of them from the gentleman whom she might have preferred. And what a perilous situation such a scheme presented to her. Do I dare reject the hand of a second gentleman with the span of so short a time out of some vague hope of receiving a proposal from another, one that will likely never unfold? Elizabeth was silent. She stared. She mused. Lieutenant Wickham must have read in her silence acquiescence, were one to judge by his very satisfied expression. Miss Elizabeth, you have made me the happiest man in all of England, he said, taking her hand in his. When shall I speak with your father? She was silent no more. I beg your pardon, sir, Elizabeth cried. I asked when I shall speak with your father. Although I confess to having never found myself in such a felicitous situation as this, I do believe it is the usual manner in which one proceeds, having been blessed with a favorable reply to one's proposal of marriage. Sir, I fear you presume too much, for I did not recall saying anything in response to your proposal. No, but surely you do not intend to refuse me. And why would you assume such a thing? Elizabeth asked, freeing her hand. Am I not a particular favorite of yours? Have I not attended you most prodigiously over the past weeks? You can have no reason not to agree to my proposal. I will confess that I am not very rich. Then again, neither are you. And with that said, I shall make no demand of that nature on your father, since I am well aware that it could not be complied with. Elizabeth's mind wandered to an earlier time when she heard words of a similar vein from her ridiculous cousin, Mr. Collins. She could easily dismiss them coming from him, but the gentleman standing before her was no Mr. Collins. But for 2 fundamental reasons, she simply could not find it in herself to say yes. For one, there was a matter of the gentleman's past attachment, albeit fleeting, with a Miss Mary King. Everyone in Meryton knows Lieutenant Wickham had set his cap on that young lady once she inherited £10,000. Who would not look upon me as a substitute? If I am totally honest with myself, the issue of Mr. Wickham's proposals on the heels of Miss Mary King's defection has little to do with anything. Truth be told, Elizabeth had not entirely taught herself to accept that Mr. Darcy was lost to her forever. He had left Hertfordshire just as suddenly as he had arrived, and who was to say he might ever return? Surely if his aunt has her way, he is already or will soon be married to his cousin, Miss Anne de Bourgh. There was also the matter of her rejection of her cousin's hand, though such instances as a woman spurning a gentleman's hand ought to be held in some degree of confidence. With her mother perceiving herself as the aggrieved party in this scheme, Elizabeth felt everyone in Meryton must surely know what she had done, even if they did not speak openly about it. I do not dare refuse such a respectable man's offer of marriage so soon after rejecting my cousin. My mother would be prostrate with grief over such a prospect. Why, even my father might not understand, especially with the gentleman in question being Mr. Wickham, a frequent and often celebrated guest in our home. Elizabeth wanted, nay, needed more time before answering the question. Wickham must have surmised that she needed time as well, for he said, I know that the prospect of being a lieutenant's wife might give you pause. You are a gentleman's daughter, reared to have maids and servants, a home of your own. He took her by the hand once more. You must trust me when I say that I will give you all that. Indeed, my late godfather bestowed upon me the living in Kempton once it becomes available. You need not worry on that account. Still holding her hand in his, he gave it a gentle squeeze. What say you that instead of giving me an answer, you take time to think about what I have proposed? I love you, Miss Elizabeth. I shall wait for you. Elizabeth did not want to consider herself mercenary, but Mr. Wickham's account of the living in Kempton was not without its merits. While her heart had not been touched by the handsome gentleman standing before her and holding her hand in his, she was fond of him. Indeed, she had grown to like him very much. Who is to say that in time I might not grow to love him? From where she stood, she rather doubted such a change in sentiment would manifest itself any time soon. How can it? For so much as I am wont to deny it, I fear my heart already belongs to another. Chapter 22. Terribly distracted. The span of 3.5 days was not enough to relieve Elizabeth of her utter dismay. How wretched it was to find herself in the unenviable position of rejecting the hand of yet another gentleman. I cannot help it. I believe in love, however impractical the sentiment may be. Who is to say when, or where, or even if I may have a chance to suffer such a sentimentality again? She paced the floor. Do I not owe it to myself to wait just a little longer? Charlotte was 27 before marrying and leaving her father's home. Can I not allow myself another couple of years at most? Elizabeth was sensible enough to know that no two circumstances were ever the same. The only thing I have weighing against me is that my father's estate is entailed to the male line. There has always been the very real possibility that my mother, my sisters, and I may very well be thrown into the hedgerows should my father meet with an untimely passing. With 5 daughters and no sons, it is imperative that at least one of us marry, and to the extent either of us can help it, marry well. Oh, I shall not think of that today. Otherwise, I shall find myself growing terribly distracted. Grabbing her bonnet and coat, Elizabeth set off for her second solitary ramble that morning. As had been the case earlier, she chose a completely different path from that which she usually favored, for it simply would not do were she to meet Lieutenant Wickham. She had managed to avoid being alone with him quite successfully, even though he had called on Longbourn, as was his nearly daily wont to do. Having been privy to the news that he was going away to town on business was just the balm Elizabeth needed to calm her warring spirits. In fact, upon returning to Longbourn in time to hear that she had missed Mr. Wickham, who was still very much perceived as her younger sister's favorite beau, she was not disappointed in the least bit. She was, however, rather pleased to be handed a letter from her friend Charlotte, whom Elizabeth had not heard from since the wedding. Therein was an invitation. Elizabeth's thoughts, upon receiving a request from Charlotte to come to Kent for a visit at Easter, were a mixture of trepidation and relief. She dreaded the idea of spending time with her ridiculous cousin Mr. Collins, whose offer of marriage she had spurned, and in no uncertain terms. Yet she was relieved to have the excuse of being away from Hertfordshire, and consequently Lieutenant Wickham, whose offer of marriage she had no intention of accepting. At least she did not think she would. How can I, so long as I continue to suffer even the tiniest shred of hope? Even if he were committed to another, nothing is really over until it is over. Therein was another reason that her friend's invitation proved too tempting to ignore. Visiting Charlotte would put Elizabeth in proximity to the young woman who might one day be Mrs. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Charlotte's letter had made mention of the young lady, their budding friendship and the like, but nothing to suggest she had recently enjoyed a change in marital status. There was also the matter of Mr. Darcy himself. Wickham's proclivity to talk almost to the point of rambling about his former friend Mr. Darcy had revealed a thing or two about the latter's favorite habits, specifically that he always visited his aunt in Kent at Easter. Her visit would put her directly in his path once more. One way or another, by the time Elizabeth's visit with Charlotte was over, she would know precisely where she stood with both gentlemen. Chapter 23. Steadfast Resolve. Cheapside, London. Having grown weary of sitting by the window in her aunt Mrs. Gardner's home day after day with no sign of Mr. Bingley, Jane was much relieved to at last receive a visit from the gentleman's sister. Quickly reasoning that Miss Bingley had simply been unable to convey the message to her brother of Jane's being in town, Jane greeted her with great warmth. "Miss Bingley, what a pleasure it is to see you again," said Jane. "I pray all is well with your family, Mr. and Mrs. Hurst," she added tentatively. "Mr. Bingley?" "Indeed, they are all well," replied Miss Bingley. "May I offer you tea?" "You are very kind, Miss Bennet. However, I am afraid I am unable to avail myself of your generosity, for I will not be here very long." "Oh?" "My purpose in coming here is twofold," Miss Bingley began, removing her gloves. "First, I came to return the kindness you paid to me by calling on me in Mayfair so soon upon your arrival in town." "Indeed, it was my pleasure." "Yes, but I fear that you may have done so in the hope of seeing my brother, which brings me to the second purpose of my being here. I thought I made myself perfectly clear in the letter that I wrote to you explaining our departure from Hertfordshire. You do recall what I said, do you not?" How could Jane forget? Miss Bingley had gone out of her way to suggest that her brother, Charles, was intended for his friend Mr. Darcy's younger sister, Miss Georgiana Darcy. The following words, as expressed in Miss Bingley's letter, echoed through Jane's mind. "I really do not think Georgiana Darcy has her equal for beauty, elegance, and accomplishments, and the affection she inspires in Louisa and me is heightened into something still more interesting from the hope we dare entertain of her being hereafter our sister." Owing mainly to the persuasiveness of her own sister's testimony, Jane rather doubted the veracity of Miss Bingley's claims, and hence her purpose for being in town. She was nothing if not determined to see Mr. Bingley, and have him tell her himself, if it were indeed the case, that he and Miss Darcy were more than mere acquaintances. After all the time the two of us spent in each other's company, mutually admiring each other, I believe it is the least he can do. Feeling more and more that she was in the presence of an adversary, Jane chose to hold her tongue. She nodded as pleasantly as someone of Jane's temperament might be expected to do, which encouraged Miss Bingley to continue her speech. "Capital!" the other woman exclaimed. "Then you will understand why I feel it is imperative that you make no further attempts to see my brother. I believe a continued association between the two of you might prove extremely detrimental to my brother's future happiness with Miss Darcy. He is too easily distracted by every young woman with a pretty face whom he meets, as his behavior in Hertfordshire proved. Let me assure you that you are not the first to make him forget what he is about, and you surely will not be the last. Far better that he fulfills his obligations to our family, and marry an equally pretty young lady with connections and her own fortune. I am sure you will agree." With that said, the young lady stood, prompting Jane to do likewise. "I am delighted we had this little discussion, Miss Bennet, which, for my part, is long overdue. I shall take my leave of you, assured in the knowledge that you will have no part in ruining my brother's future prospects." She curtsied a little. "Goodbye, Miss Bennet." And with that, the young lady was gone almost as quickly as she had arrived, leaving Jane standing there, silent, flummoxed, and quite taken aback. Moments later, Mrs. Gardiner entered the room. "Jane, my dear, I was told you had a guest." The younger woman smiled awkwardly. "Miss Bingley returned my call. I know you were hoping for a chance to see the young lady again. I am surprised she has taken her leave so soon. She could not have been here more than 10 minutes. 10 minutes that seemed like 10 hours, Jane said, nearly imperceptibly. Mrs. Gardiner regarded her niece intently. "Something tells me that the visit did not go so well as you might have hoped." "I fear that is an understatement." "What happened?" "Miss Bingley's purpose in coming here was to ensure that I never again make an effort to see her brother. She meant to remind me that he and Miss Georgiana Darcy are intended for each other. An amiable, intelligent, elegant woman, and a great favorite with all her long-born nieces, Mrs. Gardiner took Jane's hand in hers and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I am sorry, my dear." "Oh, you need not feel sorry for me, for I do not believe a word of what Miss Bingley had to say. Lizzie was right about her. I see it more plainly now than ever before. Miss Bingley has her heart set upon an alliance between her family and the Darcys, and she will stop at nothing to see that it comes about. Well, she made a grave mistake in coming here to see me, for now I am more determined than ever to see Mr. Bingley. Let him tell me face to face if what his sister says is true." Releasing her niece's hand, she clapped her own hands together. "Bravo, Jane! I am quite impressed with this steadfast resolve on your part. No doubt your sister Lizzie will feel the same way, too. I know not what else to do. Of course, it will take some effort to place myself in Mr. Bingley's path. You may rely on me to assist you in any manner you deem necessary." Jane embraced the older woman. "It means a great deal to me to hear you say that, dearest aunt. I think I know precisely how to go about making a start." Pray do not keep me in suspense. Shall we plan a trip to Mayfair for a bit of shopping, or perhaps a night at the theater?" Releasing her embrace, Jane said, "I am given to consider that we ought to do both. That is, if such a scheme meets with your approval." "Again, my dearest Jane, I am amenable to doing whatever is required to bring about a reunion between Mr. Charles Bingley and you. I believe Miss Caroline Bingley chose the wrong person to browbeat today." Chapter 24. Utmost Discretion. Lady Catherine de Bourgh was most seriously displeased, which must surely explain why she had instructed her butler to show her uninvited guest into the west parlor, the one she rarely, if ever, occupied, owing to its distance from the rooms she usually preferred. After forcing the interloper to wait for over an hour, she sauntered into the room. There he stood, his arms folded leisurely behind his back, while he stared out the window, no doubt taking in the view. "What is the meaning of this? How dare you come to my home uninvited, Mr. Wickham?" "Come now, your ladyship. Is that any way to greet me? Especially in light of our mutual purposes of late? May I remind you of the need for utmost discretion? How dare you come here to my own home for all the world to see? I would beg your forgiveness, but as I am certain you will be pleased by my happy news, you will be thanking me for this intrusion. Unless you were here to tell me that you have married the second eldest Bennet daughter, then you can have nothing to say of any consequence, I assure you. My purpose in being here has everything to do with Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Circumstances have compelled me to reconsider your generous proposition to offer the young woman my hand in marriage." "Circumstances? What circumstances? I was told you spurned my offer, so certain as you were that you had landed a far better prize." "I am afraid things did not work out as I had planned." "You mean to say the young lady's father thwarted your scheme to get your greedy hands on his daughter's recently inherited fortune of £10,000 by sending her off to Liverpool to stay with her uncle? I know it all." Wickham shrugged. "Well, there's that. However, I cannot say that I am entirely disappointed, for I am here to accept the scheme you propose. I shall marry Miss Elizabeth in exchange for a generous settlement from you." Standing straight and tall, he gave his red coat a sharp tug. "I have traveled all this way to tell you that I have upheld my end of the bargain by proposing to the young lady, and now I humbly request that you uphold yours." "Bargain? What bargain?" Lady Catherine inquired, feigning ignorance of the scheme she had set in motion by way of her informant, Thomas Teller. "I do not know that I owe you anything. As I said, you rejected my proposal, and in no uncertain terms. And now, when my purposes have been accomplished with no trouble at all to myself, you expect me to reward you? Do not be absurd." "As it happens, your ladyship, your purposes have not been accomplished, not entirely. You see, I offered my hand to Miss Elizabeth, but we are not yet married. The way I see it, I can still be of service to you, a service that ought to be rewarded handsomely." "Married or not," her ladyship exclaimed with energy, "a betrothal is sufficient enough. The young lady would be foolish to break the engagement, and in so doing cause a scandal." "Were she and I betrothed, I might be inclined to agree. However, despite my offering my hand, Miss Elizabeth has not yet given me an answer. She asked for time to consider my proposal, and I agreed. That is just the sort of gentleman I am." She scoffed at this declaration. "Then you can have no reason at all to stand here before me suggesting that you might be of service. On the contrary, I assure you that Miss Elizabeth is not immune to me. I need only press my point, and she will say yes. One might say, I have a way with the ladies." She threw up her hands. "Very well. Return to me with proof of your nuptials, and I will uphold the terms of the original proposal." "I think not, your ladyship. I have no reason to trust your word considering your initial response today. I propose you pay me half the amount of your initial offer now, and I will trust you to pay the balance once Miss Elizabeth and I are married." The officer brushed the tiniest hint of lint from his sleeve. "It is only fair that both of us have some stake in this scheme. I am, after all, not without other options. And if I am to settle for the daughter of a country gentleman who has no fortune and one who lacks connections, I feel I ought to be well compensated." Later, having dismissed George Wickham with a partial reward for his services, Lady Catherine was absolutely beside herself. What is this Miss Elizabeth Bennet about? What young lady in her position, and whose circumstances are such as they are, would dare spurn the hand of not just one but two eligible gentlemen, one a parson and the other an officer in Her Majesty's army? Peering out the window at her well-manicured gardens, the answer then dawned on her. There can be no explanation for such imprudent behavior. That young upstart has set her cap on a far grander prize, namely, my nephew, Darcy. This is not to be borne. Chapter 25. Such a Stratagem. In due course, Elizabeth set off on her journey to spend time with her friend Charlotte. Having been apart from Jane since the start of the new year, when Jane went to London to stay with the Gardiners, she relished the chance to spend time with her dear sister before venturing on to Kent. Elizabeth was relieved to discover that her sister's spirits were considerably better than they were since the two of them were together at Longbourn, despite Jane's having no success in placing herself in Mr. Bingley's path. A retelling of Miss Bingley's visit to Cheapside sufficiently explained the reason for Jane's improved attitude. "Oh, Jane," Elizabeth said, once Jane had fully enlightened her, "I cannot tell you how happy I am to know that you no longer suffer any misunderstandings where that dreadful Caroline Bingley is concerned, and you see her for who she truly is. Lizzie, you are far too generous to remind me that it took long enough, and for that I must thank you. Far be it from me to dictate the inner workings of another person's mind," Elizabeth said, her voice nostalgic. No doubt concerned, Jane said, "Is there something that I ought to know about the happenings in your own life? Perhaps something concerning your impending visit with our dear Charlotte?" "I think perhaps I should not be telling you any of this, but I fear if I do not speak with someone, I shall go completely distracted," Elizabeth cried. "Dearest Lizzie, you know that you can tell me anything," Jane responded. "It has to do with Mr. Darcy." "Mr. Darcy? Indeed. Oh, Jane, Mr. Darcy he is engaged." No doubt, as affected in hearing this as Elizabeth had been in saying it, Jane cried, "Engaged? To whom?" "To his cousin, Miss Anne de Bourgh." "But when could this have happened?" "It is my understanding that he has been engaged all along, for so long as we have known him." "Who told you this?" "Mr. Wickham." "Then I suppose it must be true." "Certainly. He would have no reason to lie, despite the history of ill feelings between the two of them." "Lizzie," Jane said, as though wishing to speak on other matters, "I am compelled to ask you about a subject of which you may not be eager to discuss. Mind you, you have every right to keep your own counsel on this, but I believe I would be terribly remiss were I not to broach the subject, to say nothing of my being full of unsatisfied curiosity." "Jane, I know what you are about to ask, or at least I suspect you are too curious to know how I shall respond to Mr. Wickham." "Indeed, other than your initial correspondence informing me of his proposal and swearing me to secrecy, you have not mentioned the gentleman's name in any of your subsequent letters." Elizabeth shrugged. "There has been nothing more to say." "How much longer do you plan to keep the gentleman in suspense?" "I am sure you think I am selfish in insisting that I have more time to consider his proposal, but I have only just refused one offer of marriage. Mamma would surely suffer a fit of apoplexy were she to learn that I turned down yet another." "It sounds as though you have made up your mind as far as Mr. Wickham is concerned." "And you think I ought to tell him sooner rather than later." "I am sure you have your reasons for keeping the gentleman on tenterhooks." "And you do not agree with such a stratagem?" "I shall not try to tell you how to behave in this situation. I am certain you know what you are about." "Jane, you know me too well. I confess a part of me is reluctant to refuse a second offer of marriage out of fear that I may never receive such an offer again. There, I have said it. I only pray you will not judge me too severely, whatever my ultimate decision may be." Jane placed her hand on her younger sister's hand. "I shall endeavor not to judge you at all." Chapter 26. True to her word. Elizabeth stood there as the church bells rang. The memory of that fateful day was as vivid to her as though it had happened just yesterday, yet it had been months ago. Elizabeth had entered the church as the intimate friend of Miss Charlotte Lucas. She had emerged as the utterly confused friend of Mrs. Charlotte Collins. How did Charlotte do it? She had asked herself repeatedly from the time she learned of her friend's engagement, and even as her friend stood at the altar exchanging vows that would bind her forever to the same man who had offered his hand to another practically hours before. Charlotte Lucas, the usurper, is how her friend had been described, at least by Elizabeth's mother. Not that Elizabeth suffered such sentiments, for she surely would not have married her cousin, even if he were the last man alive. She simply wanted better for her friend. Now, faced with the dilemma of what to do regarding yet another less than desirable offer of marriage, she finally suffered a better understanding of Charlotte's choice. Elizabeth's mother had made her life at Longbourn almost intolerable in the wake of her rejection of Mr. Collins's hand. Mrs. Bennet had vowed never to speak to Elizabeth again as a consequence of her decision, a decision the former steadfastly proclaimed as selfish and unthinking. How she wished that her mother had remained true to her word. Elizabeth was not even 21, yet her mother made her seem as though she were such a bird. Charlotte was 27 when she married. I can no longer fault Charlotte if her situation in her father's home was half as unbearable as mine has become. Now Elizabeth sat in the carriage on her way to visit her friend Charlotte in Hunsford, and so much as she did not relish the idea of spending time in her cousin's home, she was not immune to the fact of what a blessing the invitation had turned out to be. What great timing, indeed, for it had come not a moment too soon, affording Elizabeth the perfect excuse to escape the confines of Longbourn, if only for a few weeks or so. The trip also provided the ideal means of avoiding the matter of Lieutenant Wickham's proposal. It is not as though the prospect of marriage to such a man is wholly unacceptable. He is a decent and honorable man, whom I respect. Life as the wife of an officer must certainly have its fair share of advantages. All in all, I can imagine I would have no cause to repine. Indeed, reasons to provide a favorable reply to the gentleman always outnumber reasons to say no. But for one thing, I do not love him. Charlotte's practical nature once again came to mind. I can only imagine what she would say to me were she to learn that I may very well reject the hand of yet another perfectly decent man. Elizabeth sighed. I simply would not tell her. I have managed to keep Mr. Wickham's proposal a secret thus far. Other than Jane, no one knows. Not my mother, not my father, not my younger sisters. Surely Jane would never betray my confidence. She pursed her lips. I must give the gentleman all due credit in that regard. Not only has he agreed to wait for my return to Hertfordshire before receiving a reply, he has also promised not to confide any of this to anyone. Perhaps he is just the sort of gentleman with whom I might one day fall in love. Chapter 27. His True Feelings. Days later, her ladyship closed her missive and placed it on the table. She picked up her cup of tea and tasted it, and finding it to her liking, nodded, a subtle command for the servant to be on his way. It would appear that the Collinses' house guest has arrived at the parsonage, and is settling in quite comfortably. Directing her penetrating gaze at her nephew, Mr. Darcy, she pursed her lips. By the by, their visitor is someone who will claim an acquaintance with you. Darcy could only think of one person of his shared acquaintance with Mr. and Mrs. Collins, whom he would wish to acknowledge, and that was Mrs. Collins's friend, Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Having learned soon after his arrival in Kent of Mr. Collins's marriage to Elizabeth's friend on the heels of Elizabeth's own refusal of his hand, and having spent enough time since arriving in Kent in the man's company to understand her reasoning, Darcy's admiration for Elizabeth had increased 100-fold. Despite Elizabeth's affections for Mrs. Collins, no doubt Collins himself is one of the last persons in the world with whom she would suffer an extended visit. Lady Catherine was still regarding him rather pointedly, and thus compelled to respond, he said, No doubt you are referring to Mrs. Collins's father, Sir William Lucas. Indeed, I had the honor of meeting him on numerous occasions during my stay in Hertfordshire. Darcy could not help but remember one occasion in particular. The evening at Lucas Lodge when he admitted to Elizabeth how much he admired her, how he wished to know her better, and how he had asked for permission to call on her at Longbourn. It seems like years ago, when in truth it was mere months. A longing to see the young woman who had bewitched him as no other woman had ever done before came over him, and he secretly wished that the visitor to whom his aunt alluded was indeed Miss Elizabeth. "I fear you are mistaken, for it is not Mrs. Collins's father of whom I speak, rather a relation of Mr. Collins. It is his cousin, Miss Elizabeth Bennet." Darcy endeavored to hide his pleasure in hearing this, for it simply would not do to allow his aunt even the slightest hint of his true feelings. True enough, he had told himself for months that leaving Hertfordshire when he did was for the best. Regardless of his steadily increasing admiration for the beguiling young woman, an alliance between the two of them would be frowned upon. Such had been his feelings then. Now that she was so close, he could no longer vouch for his resolve. "I suppose I ought to call on the parsonage, as a matter of courtesy," he heard himself say. "I believe that is a splendid idea, nephew." Taken aback, he uttered, "Do my ears deceive me, Lady Catherine?" "I think it is a splendid idea for you to call on the parsonage on behalf of the house of Rosings. In fact, I suggest you escort Anne. She is very fond of Mrs. Collins, and will no doubt be just as fond of her friend. Is that not true, my dear child?" All eyes turned to Anne de Bourgh, who, in typical fashion, was being fussed over by her companion, Mrs. Jenkinson. Bearing witness to this, Darcy endeavored not to judge his cousin too severely, although he was often given to wonder if she ever lifted a finger on her own behalf. On the other hand, Anne was of a somewhat sickly constitution, and there was always her poor health as a convenient excuse. Anne's lack of response warranted a repetition of the question by her companion, no less, and Anne nodded. "Then it is settled," said Lady Catherine. "The two of you shall call on the parsonage house together. Mrs. Jenkinson, will you please accompany Anne to her apartment to retrieve her shawl? I fear the weather is rather brisk this afternoon, and I would not wish to hazard my daughter's catching a cold." The other woman nodded, and soon she and her charge stood in preparation to leave. Darcy arose from his seat as well and stretched his long legs after sitting in one attitude for so long. "I shall await you in the courtyard, Anne," he said. He, too, proceeded to quit the room. Her ladyship had other ideas. "I would have a word with you before you go, nephew." "Of course, Lady Catherine. How may I be of service?" She waited until it was just the two of them before speaking. "I would ask you to extend my felicitations to Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Pray tell her I should like to meet with her personally here at Rosings to wish her joy." Darcy felt as though he had been slapped in the face. "Whatever do you mean? Why would you wish Miss Elizabeth joy?" "Why, as a consequence of her impending nuptials. Is that not the usual reason for such civility?" He could not bring himself to speak the words. "Is Miss Elizabeth, is she... "Engaged to be married. Indeed, she is. She is engaged to a gentleman with whom we have all had the misfortune of claiming an acquaintance at one point or another. Indeed, she is engaged to be married to none other than George Wickham." Though he was outside the confines of Rosings and on his way to the parsonage house, Darcy felt very much like the walls of anguish, misery, and dismay were closing in all around him. After speaking at length with his aunt to ascertain the veracity of her claim, he had tried in vain to persuade his cousin Anne against accompanying him, and thus she sat next to him in the carriage. He dared not take his anger out on Anne, even though he knew with certainty that she had made the short trip to the parsonage house on her own on a frequent basis. It annoyed him even more to serve as her escort at a time when all he really wanted was to summon his great steed and race across the fields with utter abandon, anything to clear his head before coming face to face with Elizabeth. He was not surprised that she was not entirely immune to George Wickham's charms. Worldlier women than Elizabeth had been taken in by that vile man. He thought surely she knew not to allow herself to form any serious attachment to such a man, especially after she had rejected her cousin, an honorable, albeit ridiculous man who had the means of providing her with a comfortable, respectable manner of living. George Wickham is neither honorable nor respectable. He has nothing to offer her, no home, no connections, nothing other than a pretty smile and happy manners. Would that make her happy? Is that all she wants in life? If such is the case, I fear I never really knew Miss Elizabeth at all." As Charlotte was standing by the window looking at her small garden, she bore witness to the arrival of the Rosings party. Thus her husband's abrupt entrance into the parlor where she and Elizabeth sat proclaiming the happy news was rendered entirely superfluous. Paying him no mind, she hurried to Elizabeth's side. Speaking in a hushed tone, she said, "I may thank you, Eliza, for this piece of civility. Mr. Darcy would never have come to wait upon me. I do believe he is just as fascinated with you now as he was when he was in Hertfordshire." "Oh, Charlotte, you are incorrigible," Elizabeth exclaimed. "Is a gentleman not allowed to call on his acquaintances without being accused of suffering such sentiments as you espouse?" "Were he any other gentleman, I would be inclined to agree with you. However, Mr. Darcy is not just any other gentleman, as I am sure you will agree. What's more, he has been in Kent for some time, and not once did he deign to call on the parsonage. And before you credit his civility to his wanting to accompany his cousin Anne, I assure you that Anne has made her way here a great many times on her own." Before Elizabeth could say more to refute her friend's supposition, the Rosings party was announced by the doorbell, and shortly afterwards the three guests entered the room. Mr. Darcy led the way. So tall, so handsome. The sight of him stole Elizabeth's breath away, but she hardly had time to think about the feeling that seeing him again after so long a separation engendered in her before her attention was drawn by the ladies in his party. The younger of the two she surmised as being Miss Anne de Bourgh, which proved quite disturbing for Elizabeth, for surely her presence was confirmation of the alleged attachment between the two cousins. And as it was Elizabeth herself who was deemed the stranger in the room, she felt as though all eyes were trained on her, especially Mr. Darcy's. When at last the requisite introductions were made and all the usual civilities were exchanged, everyone took their seats. To Elizabeth's surprise, Mr. Darcy chose a seat closest to hers, a position which placed him at an inconvenient distance from his so-called betrothed. Not long into the visit, Charlotte made some excuse which compelled her husband to quit the room, albeit reluctantly, for it was not every day that he found himself attending such distinguished guests in his own home. After he was gone, Charlotte took it upon herself to command the greater share of Mr. Bourgh's attention. This left Elizabeth with the task of entertaining Mr. Darcy. Not that Elizabeth minded, but she could not deny that the thought of speaking with him in a manner in which the two of them had grown accustomed while in Hertfordshire was a bit disconcerting in the presence of his intended. Still, some conversation must be had, and as he was exercising a curious degree of reserve, she made a start. "My eldest sister, Jane, has been in town these past months visiting my aunt and uncle. Have you never happened to see her there?" She supposed she knew him well enough to discern if his answer to her question would betray any consciousness of what had passed between Miss Bingley and Jane, and thus she studied him intently, awaiting his response. Shifting a little in his seat, he said, "I am afraid I have not been so fortunate as to meet Miss Bennet in town." Assured that he had spoken truthfully, Elizabeth simply smiled. She said no more. "If we are to have further conversation, then he must be the one to make the next start." Did he ever? Leaning closer to her, Mr. Darcy said, "Miss Elizabeth, may I have the honor of a private audience with you?" "Are you asking me to leave the room with you at this very moment, sir? Whatever will everyone think? Specifically, what will your cousin think?" "No, not at this very moment. As I recall, you have a great fondness for solitary rambles during the early morning hours. I am asking if you will meet me tomorrow at dawn. The lanes are beautiful and perfectly safe, and I know of any number of spots that we might meet where our privacy will be assured." "Heaven forbid that your cousin should learn the two of us are planning a secret rendezvous." "Are you saying you will not meet me?" Darcy asked. "I suppose what I am saying is that it is rather impolitic of you to propose such an assignation with your cousin sitting opposite us in this very room." "Pray, let us not discuss my cousin, for she has nothing to do with my wish to meet with you." "Are you quite certain, sir?" "Of course I am certain. Why would you suggest otherwise?" He glanced over at the part of the room where his cousin sat with Mrs. Collins. After a moment, he returned his attention to Elizabeth. "Is it because she accompanied me here this afternoon? Let me assure you that we came together solely at my Aunt Lady Catherine's adamant insistence." Elizabeth said nothing. Based solely on George Wickham's frequent accounting, she knew as well as anyone that Lady Catherine de Bourgh was the fiercest proponent of her nephew's engagement to her daughter. Not once had she heard any real confirmation of it, certainly not from Mr. Darcy. Do I not owe him a chance to tell his side of the story? I think I do. Thus resolved, she said, "Very well, sir. I shall meet you as you have requested." The beauty of the massive stone structure atop a small incline just beyond a stone bridge immediately came into Elizabeth's mind. She had passed it by while in the carriage on the way to the parsonage house. Never had she seen such a place with such natural beauty, surrounded by evidence of the budding spring season. She had planned to return to that area the first chance she got, persuaded that the next day was as good a time as any, she said. "I recall seeing a stone temple on my journey here. I shall be there in the morning." "At dawn," he insisted. She nodded. "At dawn." Chapter 28. Hopes and Dreams. Although present at the theater in body, Charles Bingley's mind was miles and miles away. It did not help that all he had managed to do during the weeks since he left Hertfordshire was think of Miss Jane Bennet. Now he had persuaded himself that he was seeing her everywhere he went, sometimes on the crowded London streets, other times inside fashionable shops in Mayfair, and now the theater. As one by one he had sought to confirm each suspected sighting, only to be met with disappointment. He was certain tonight would be no different. Still, it was all he could do to remain in his seat until the performance's intermezzo. When at last the curtain fell, Bingley excused himself from his party and made his way among the throngs of people standing about in the grand hallway. He espied her from a distance. This time there was no mistaking. The angelic creature, donning a fashionable pale blue gown with just a hint of a blonde lock escaping her upswept hair, had to be Miss Bennet. Bingley almost pushed his way through the crowd, and soon he was standing face to face with her. His heart raced. He felt as though no time at all had passed since he was dancing with her that last evening at Netherfield. "Miss Bennet," he said, rather unceremoniously. He then remembered to bow. "Mr. Bingley," she replied, while dropping a curtsy. "What a pleasure it is to see you this evening." "The pleasure is all mine," Jane said, offering her hand. He responded in the usual way, save a seemingly reluctance to release her fingers. "Allow me to introduce you to my relations," Jane said at length. "Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, my aunt and uncle." After the usual pleasantries were exchanged, Bingley said, "I am here with my relations as well. I am certain they will be delighted to see you again." He then tossed a quick glance over his shoulder. "Oh, there are my sisters Louisa and Caroline." The latter of the two had no doubt observed her brother already. Her face bore a disagreeable grimace when he waved his hand, beckoning her presence. "Caroline," he said, when she joined his party, "here is Miss Bennet, our neighbor from Hertfordshire, and her relations. Allow me to introduce you." Jane said, "I am sure that will not be necessary, sir, for your sister and my relations have already met. Good evening, Miss Bingley." Of course they had done no such thing, but Jane had no wish to expose her dearest relations to Miss Bingley's unmasked disdain. Miss Bingley merely nodded and curtsied. Jane said, "I called on your sister when I arrived in London weeks ago." She regarded the other woman intently. "You do remember, do you not, Miss Bingley? I recall you returned my visit by calling on me at Cheapside, not too long thereafter." "Indeed," Miss Bingley said. "How could I possibly forget? It was such a pleasure seeing you, only I was certain that after our last meeting you had planned to return to Hertfordshire. It would seem you took your leave so suddenly that you mistook my intention." Bingley cried, "Caroline, I had no idea Miss Bennet was in town. How long have you known? More importantly, why did you not tell me?" Jane said, "You must not fault your sister for failing to tell you of my presence here in town. No doubt she has far weightier concerns with which to occupy her mind. London can be quite diverting." "Yes, and never more so than this time of year. Still, I fear I have been quite remiss in allowing so much time to pass, even unknowingly, before calling on you. I hope you will allow me to make amends, Miss Bennet." He cleared his throat. "May I call on you along with my sister, Caroline?" Miss Bingley's aversion to such a notion was written all over her face. She colored, she stared, and yet she stayed silent. What of your friend, Mr. Darcy? How does he get along?" Jane interjected by way of changing the subject. "The last time I saw him in town, he was getting along quite nicely. He has since traveled to Kent, which he usually does at this time of year, to visit his aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and his cousin, Miss Anne de Bourgh." Though subterfuge of this kind was not in Jane's nature, she did not confess to being aware of Mr. Darcy's present whereabouts. Certainly her own sister had alluded to his being there. "Indeed," she said, speaking more for her sister's sake than anything else, "my sister is visiting her intimate friend, Mrs. Collins, in Hunsford. Perchance Lizzie and Mr. Darcy will have an opportunity to renew their acquaintance." Jane smiled deep down inside, for Caroline's subsequent discomfort in hearing this was a reward in and of itself. "No doubt the two of them will enjoy such a prospect very much. One would have had to be blind not to see how much they were drawn to each other," said Mr. Bingley. "Indeed they were," Jane replied. "And what of Mr. Darcy's sister, Miss Georgiana Darcy?" Again, Jane's question was meant to arouse Miss Bingley's discomfort. "That I cannot say with any level of certainty. I suppose Miss Darcy is here in town, for I am aware that Darcy set up an establishment for her. But she and I are not so well acquainted that I have had occasion or reason to call on her." "Is that so?" Jane asked. "Pardon me, but I was given to believe the two of you shared a rather close connection." He shook his head. "No, save the connection between Darcy and me. His sister and I are best described as mere acquaintances." "Come along, Charles," Caroline cried with energy. "I am certain we have taken up quite enough of Miss Bennet's time. What is more, we really should return to our seats." At his wife's silent urging, Mr. Gardiner said, "We would be most honored if you would take a family dinner with us, Mr. Bingley. My Hertfordshire relations spoke very highly of you when we were all together at Christmas. I should be delighted to have the chance to get better acquainted with you." Bingley shook his head with some enthusiasm. "Oh, thank you, sir. I shall be honored, indeed, to know you better as well. I gladly accept your invitation." By now, his sister had leaned her arm firmly inside his and was coaxing him away. "Well, again, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, Miss Bennet, it has been a pleasure seeing you this evening. I know I speak not only for myself but my sister as well in saying we look forward to joining your family for dinner." "Shall we say 2 nights hence, sir?" Mrs. Gardiner remembered to ask. "Indeed," said Bingley, as his sister continued to tug at him to move things along. "I shall see you in 2 nights hence, Miss Bennet." When they were far enough away, Caroline's ire would no longer be repressed. "Charles, what on earth were you thinking in accepting an invitation to dine with those people, in Cheapside no less, and what is even worse, on my behalf?" "My goodness, Caroline, Miss Bennet is our neighbor. It would be completely reprehensible to deny such an acquaintance merely because we now found ourselves back in London. No doubt you agree, or else you would not have called on them already. By the by, why did you not tell me before that Miss Bennet had called on you, and that you had returned the call?" "Why do you think, Charles?" "I hardly know what to think. I was given to believe you were quite fond of Miss Bennet. You could not possibly have failed to comprehend my own sentiments toward her as well." "On the contrary, dear brother, it is not as though you have made any effort to see her since you took your leave of Hertfordshire in November. I rather prefer to think you wanted nothing to do with her. Why would I tell you that she had followed you to town, no doubt at her mother's bidding, to bring an alliance that defies all the hopes and dreams of our own beloved father?" "I will own that I left Hertfordshire of my own accord, largely with the thought that doing so would diminish the tender regard I have for Miss Bennet. But the fact is that seeing her tonight proved the fertility of my efforts, and has taught me to hope more than ever before that something more lasting and meaningful with Miss Bennet will unfold." "Charles, you cannot be serious." "I have never been more serious in my life. Now, disapprove of me if you must, but do not dare do or say anything that will impede my quest." Chapter 29. A few moments. Days of unrelenting rain had halted effectively the comings and goings at the parsonage house. As a consequence, Elizabeth had been unable to keep her promise to meet Mr. Darcy at the Temple. When the rain stopped, the Collinses found themselves once again the happy recipients of a distinguished guest from Rosings, Mr. Darcy. Only this time he had arrived on horseback, alone. Charlotte, despite her best efforts, was not nearly so successful in arranging for some private time for her friend and Mr. Darcy, but she was able to distract her husband long enough for them to speak to each other uninterrupted for a few moments. Mr. Darcy seized upon the opportunity. "Meet me at the Temple this afternoon, Miss Elizabeth." His attitude was altered, his tone a bit too demanding, and Elizabeth searched her memory for possible reasons. Surely he is not blaming me for not meeting him before. Am I to be censured for the acts of Mother Nature? Could he be displeased by my coming here to Kent? I cannot imagine why that would be, unless he knows that in being here I shall be in a position to confront him for his neglect in telling me that he was engaged to be married to his cousin. At length she said, "Sir, under the circumstances, do you truly suppose what you are asking me to do is proper? What would Mr. Burke think if she knew?" "What do I care what my cousin thinks?" He regarded her intently. "Pray, you have not been listening to idle gossip." She shrugged. "I shall consider your request to meet you this afternoon. However, I shall make no promise." "My request is not open for debate," he declared. "There is a matter of great importance that I wish to discuss with you. Meet me at the Temple, else I shall be compelled to seek you out here at the parsonage to say what I have to say. I am certain you do not want that." "The audacity of this man!" Elizabeth silently protested. "I am not afraid of you, Mr. Darcy," Elizabeth stated, and indeed she was not. Angry best described her sentiments at that particular point in time, angry and perturbed. To her dismay, their heated exchange drew her cousin's attention. Mr. Collins exclaimed, "I do hope there is nothing amiss between you and Cousin Elizabeth, sir." "No, not at all," Darcy responded, even though his eyes were trained on Elizabeth's. "I was just telling Miss Elizabeth that I am expected at Rosings shortly. Pray give your noble aunt, Lady Catherine, our heartiest greetings." Nodding, Darcy spoke in a manner meant only for Elizabeth's ears. "Do not test me." And then he was gone. Not long thereafter, when at last the two of them stood face to face at the stone temple, Darcy's impatience was on full display. He had hardly even allowed for a proper greeting before he declared, "I cannot let you do it." "Do what, Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth exclaimed. "Why, embark upon such a foolish path, one that would surely prove to be the greatest mistake of your life." "I beg your pardon?" Elizabeth exclaimed with energy. "When I learned that you had not married the heir of your father's estate, I confess to feeling a great deal of relief, even though I will not deny that there was a time when I thought such an alliance would be most advantageous for your family. Then I learned you were engaged to marry another, and were he a respectable man, I would not be so fearful of your prospects for felicity in marriage. But your intended is not a respectable man. On the contrary, he is one of the vilest creatures who ever walked the face of this earth. He does not deserve you, and I will not stand by idly and watch you make such a grave mistake." "Excuse me, Mr. Darcy? Do you deny that you are engaged to George Wickham? How could you consider such foolishness? I know you well enough to know you fancy yourself a fine studier of people's character. Yet, where that scoundrel is concerned, you willfully choose to overlook his deep flaws. From everything I have seen and heard, even of my own accord, Mr. Wickham is indeed a respectable man. I fail to comprehend why you persist in accusing him of being otherwise. I am sure what I have said about him, which does not begin to scratch the surface of his low character, is nothing in comparison to what he has likely whispered in your ear about me. I can assure you, sir, that had Mr. Wickham, or any other person of my acquaintance for that matter, attempted to poison my mind against you, I would have paid them no attention, just as I do not intend to allow you to disparage Mr. Wickham. I am sorry, but in such cases as this, you will have no choice but to listen. I cannot, and I will not, allow you to throw your future life away out of some misguided views you have about the man." "Allow? Pardon me, Mr. Darcy, but from where I stand, I do not know that you have a choice in the matter. You, who are so wholly unconnected to me, how dare you presume to tell me what I can and cannot do? How can you stand there and suggest that we are wholly unconnected to each other? Does all the time we spend together in Hertfordshire mean nothing to you at all? Have I garnered none of the privileges of friendship, the trust, the reverence?" Elizabeth approached him directly and stared him straight in his eyes. You forfeited all such privileges when you left Hertfordshire without so much as a by your leave. There it was. She had finally uttered it out loud. How she wanted to say more, to accuse him of raising her expectations, of abandoning her. Alas, she would not, because she could not, at least not in good conscience. In truth, he had done nothing of the sort. He had promised her nothing. He had only offered her friendship. I did what I did for you and your family. For me? For my family? How could I rightfully stand in the way of what I deemed a most advantageous future prospect for you and your family, your mother and your sisters, should some ill fate befall your father? Is that what you supposed you were doing, sir? Standing in my way? You suppose your presence in Hertfordshire would have been a factor in whether I accepted or refused my cousin's hand in marriage? Not simply your cousin, the heir to your father's estate. You believe you know me so well, yet you suppose me to be mercenary, a scheming opportunist who would go into marriage with so little concern for my own happiness, so long as my family is well provided for. No, I supposed you were practical, too sensible not to recognize the gentleman's proposal for what it promised. And yet you stand here before me, adamantly opposed to the idea of my accepting the hand of another whose prospects hold a promise of its own. He scoffed. The promise of a life of misery of the acutest kind, one in which you would be unable to respect yourself because you entered in such an unholy alliance wearing blinders. Well, if you must know, those are precisely the reasons I refused my cousin's proposal, she said. As impractical as it may seem to you, I have not entirely given up on the hope of marrying for love and affection. None of those things would have been possible with my cousin. Are you saying you believe such things are possible with the likes of George Wickham? Are you saying that you love him? Elizabeth folded one arm over the other. I do not recall saying any of that. And yet you have agreed to marry the man. Her silence in the wake of hearing this was confirmation enough that it was not too late. Darcy moved closer and lifted her chin so their eyes might meet. Elizabeth, you do not have to do this. In a softened tone, she said, I fear you do not understand. My life would be unbearable were I to reject the hand of not one but two suitors, and under the span of a few months. So, rather than reject Wickham's hand, which, deep down inside, you know is the right thing to do, you have done what? You have chosen to keep him in suspense? She meant to turn away, but he would not let her. You do not need to say anything. Your answer is written all over your face. There is another way, Elizabeth. Still silent, her eyes beckoned. Is there? Marry me, Darcy said. You would marry me merely to thwart Mr. Wickham? I know you despise the man, but... No, Darcy declared, shaking his head. I want to marry you because I love you. You love me, Mr. Darcy? I do, most ardently. But when? How? I cannot fix on the precise moment or the words which laid the foundation. I believe from the first moment I saw you, my heart was irrevocably gone. I was too stubborn to believe it, too proud to think that I might so easily succumb to the malady that I often accused my friend Bingley of suffering. When I returned to town and learned soon thereafter of Collins's marriage, I assumed it was you, and I refused to ascertain the facts, knowing that it meant you were lost to me forever. But then I heard from my aunt that he had married another, and for a brief moment in time my hope was restored, only to be shattered once again by the prospect of your being engaged to yet another, to someone who is truly unworthy of you. Then this is in part because of Mr. Wickham? Elizabeth said. I cannot say that the thought of that vile man destroying all the wonderful things that make you uniquely you is not a compelling inducement. But knowing you are not officially engaged to even the most honorable man in all of England would not have prevented me from asking you to be my wife. I do not want to live my life without you, Miss Elizabeth, and from this day forward, I never wish for us to be parted again. Darcy took Elizabeth's hand in his. I know you might not love me so much as I love. Here, Elizabeth placed her finger upon his lips to silence him. I do love you more than you can ever know. A part of me knew it from the moment I learned you had left Hertfordshire. I knew it even as I feared I would never see you again. that there was a part of me that would always cherish what the two of us had when we were together, and I promised myself I would not settle for anything less from another. And now you need never have to, that is, if you will agree to accept my hand in marriage." Her hand in his, he knelt before her. "Will you do me the honor of accepting my hand? Say yes, and make me the happiest man in the world." "Yes," Elizabeth cried. "Yes, I will marry you. Nothing in the world would bring me more pleasure than to be your wife." Chapter 30. Opinion of Others. Lady Catherine was upset when she learned that her nephew Darcy had reportedly been seen on the way to the parsonage house. She could think of but one reason why he would call on the parsonage so soon after his initial visit, and that reason had nothing in the world to do with showing civility to Mr. and Mrs. Collins, two people whom her nephew likely considered so far beneath him in consequence as to be deemed laughable. No, her nephew had a more illicit motive in mind. He had not escaped the lure of the Collinses' guest, Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Why her nephew persisted in his infatuation with that young woman was anybody's guess, for so far as Lady Catherine was concerned, the young lady was no better than the Collinses. Why, Mr. Collins was the lady's own flesh and blood, albeit a distant relative. He was close enough to be the next in line to inherit the Bennet family's estate. "I suppose there is but one way for me to comprehend the attachment Miss Elizabeth Bennet holds over my nephew," Lady Catherine uttered to no one in particular. She walked across the room and rang the bell for her butler. "I shall call on the Collinses and meet this young woman for myself, and then I will know what that little country upstart and my nephew are about." Shortly thereafter, her ladyship sauntered into the parlor at the parsonage house. Startled to be receiving such illustrious company at that hour of the morning, the lady of the house rose to her feet, her sewing in hand. "Lady Catherine!" Mrs. Collins exclaimed. Remembering herself, she laid her sewing aside, and lifting her skirt just so, with both hands, she curtsied deferentially. "To what do I owe the pleasure of your company this morning?" "You can have no doubt as to the reason I have come here." Her ladyship threw a sharp glance about the room, went to the window and looked outside, and finally turned and faced Mrs. Collins. "Where is she?" Lady Catherine demanded. "I beg your pardon, your ladyship?" "I think you heard me perfectly well. Where is she?" "To whom are you referring?" Charlotte asked. "To whom do you think I am referring?" Lady Catherine responded, her indignation rising. "Pardon, are you asking about my guest, my dear friend, Miss Elizabeth Bennet?" "The one and the same, Miss Elizabeth Bennet indeed. I came to speak with her about a matter of grave importance, and I have not a minute to lose." "I am afraid my friend is not here." "Not here? But where can she be at this hour of the day? Whom does she know in this part of the country other than you and your husband?" "My friend is very fond of walking, especially during the early part of the day." "I suppose she is in the company of her lady companion. When do you expect them to return?" "My friend does not have a lady companion. I am afraid she went for a walk all alone." "A single lady traipsing about the countryside unaccompanied?" Lady Catherine exclaimed with energy. "Why, I never heard of such a thing. How could you allow such an outrage? Have you no concern whatsoever for how this must look to have a guest of yours flaunt convention in so blatant a fashion? Have you no concern for how this might affect the opinion of others as concern your own husband? He is a vicar." "Indeed, he is a vicar. But what can that have to do with my guest's desire to take a walk? I might as well tell you the reason for my visit. I know my nephew has exceeded the bounds of necessary civility by calling here at the parsonage again. I must attribute his generosity to his fascination with Miss Elizabeth Bennet. What do you have to say about that?" "The two of them are acquaintances of several months' standing. It would not be unheard of that they might wish to spend time together, just as they did while in Hertfordshire. Need I remind you, Mrs. Collins, that Mr. Darcy is engaged to marry my daughter Anne? Have you not heard me say it any number of times? Do you not consider my daughter your friend as well? Do you feel no obligation whatsoever to see that my Anne is not ill-used by your friend?" "To that I say only this. If indeed your nephew and your daughter are engaged, then you can have no reason at all to be concerned. Mr. Darcy is an honorable man. I am sure he will do that which is expected of him. Surely he knows his own mind. It is not my nephew's own mind that concerns me. He is just a man, a mere mortal, who is not immune to the arts and allurements of a scheming female. And what of your friend's engagement to Lieutenant George Wickham? What say you to that? Simply this, that supposing what you say is true, which, incidentally, I have every reason in the world to doubt, then I will be among the first to wish her joy. Her patience, no doubt at an end, her ladyship scoffed. I have neither the time nor the inclination to carry on in this manner with you, Lady Catherine insisted as she arose from her chair in preparation to quit the parsonage house. I came here to try that young woman, to ascertain her true motive in being here. As you, no doubt, are ignorant of her scheme, so uninformed that you do not know she is supposedly promised to another, you are wasting my time. With that said, the grand lady was gone directly. Chapter 31. Begs the question. When Elizabeth returned to the parsonage house, her friend Charlotte rushed to her side. "Oh, Eliza, you cannot know how happy I am to see you. Where have you been all this time?" "I beg your forgiveness, dear Charlotte. I did not mean to cause you to worry about me. You see, I went for a walk to the temple, and while there, I lost all track of time and stayed much longer than I had intended," Elizabeth replied, proceeding side by side with her friend to Charlotte's particular parlor. "The important thing is that you are here now, and you are all right. Charlotte, is there something the matter?" "All is well now, but had you arrived an hour or so earlier, you would have walked into a most unfortunate scene. You see, I had a visitor while you were away. It was Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and you will never guess the purpose of her visit." Charlotte took Elizabeth by the hand. "Come, sit with me, and I will tell you all there is to know. You see, the purpose of her ladyship's visit was not to see me, or even my husband, Mr. Collins, for that matter." "If she did not come to see you, and she did not come to see Mr. Collins, then what was the purpose of her visit?" Elizabeth asked. Even as she suspected, she knew the answer to her own question. "Lady Catherine came to see you." "She knows," Elizabeth silently exclaimed. "She knows about her nephew's feelings for me, and likewise my feelings for him." "Her ladyship came to see me?" "Indeed, and you will never guess what she had to say upon discovering that you were not here, that you had gone out for an early morning walk." "I am almost afraid to ask." "Lady Catherine said that you were engaged to Mr. Wickham." Before Elizabeth could fashion a response to her friend's declaration, Charlotte said, "I know this is a falsehood, for if it were true, then surely you would have said something to me. Surely your mother would have said something to my mother. Such an auspicious occasion as an engagement between you and Mr. Wickham is not something I would have had to hear from Lady Catherine de Bourgh of all people. Why, so far as I know, you and Lady Catherine have never laid eyes on each other, which begs the question, why would she try to convince me that you are engaged?" "Charlotte," Elizabeth began. "Eliza, is there any truth to what Lady Catherine said about you and Lieutenant Wickham? Are you engaged? Pray, Charlotte, before you rush to judgment, I implore you to hear what all I have to say." "I am listening." "First of all, there is indeed a legitimate context for what Lady Catherine told you." "Do you mean to say you are engaged to be married?" Elizabeth nodded and quickly stated, "I am engaged, but I am not engaged to Mr. Wickham." "If not to Mr. Wickham, then to whom? When did it happen? Why would her ladyship say you were engaged to the lieutenant if it is not true? You mentioned context. Do you care to tell me more about the circumstances so that I might better understand?" Elizabeth shook her head. "The truth is that Lieutenant Wickham did offer his hand in marriage to me." Charlotte's eyes opened wide, but she said nothing. I simply could not bring myself to accept his proposal. But, on the other hand, I could not fathom how my mother would have reacted were it to be made known that I had rejected a second proposal of marriage so soon after the first, when we all know it is the business of her life to marry the five of us off the first chance she gets. But I do not understand. For all I knew, the two of you have always got along exceedingly well. Mr. Wickham is agreeable. He is handsome. He is an officer, which I know must really count for something in your mother's eyes. Yes, I know he is almost everything my mother would wish for. He is handsome. He is also very agreeable. But I could not possibly say yes, even though I knew there was the potential for marital felicity. You see, Charlotte, I simply did not think it would be fair for me to accept his proposal when I have lost my heart to another. Dearest Eliza, I have never known you to be affected by anyone, unless— A knowing look overspread Charlotte's countenance. Eliza? Elizabeth nodded. A teardrop escaped her eye. It is Mr. Darcy. I am in love with Mr. Darcy, and what is more, he loves me too, most ardently. He and I are engaged. Engaged? Charlotte cried. To be married? Yes, to be married. You need not sound so surprised. I confess that I have always suspected that Mr. Darcy was more than a little affected by you. But then he went away, and I thought that was the end of that. I never suspected that you and he were in love. I never even allowed myself to hope for such a possibility. Not really, but I would be lying if I denied that a part of me secretly imagined how it might be. Now at liberty to express her pleasure, Charlotte said, Dearest Eliza, may I be the first to wish you joy? That said, I fear I must warn you, for as much as your engagement to Mr. Darcy will bring much happiness to so many, it will also cause prodigious discord to quite a few others. Are you speaking of Lieutenant Wickham? I should like to suppose he will not be too disappointed. It is not as though I am breaking an engagement. I never said I would marry him, although I do suppose some sort of explanation for my accepting Mr. Darcy's hand will be expected. I simply shall not invite worry in that regard until the time comes. I do not envy you that one bit. However, when I speak of disappointment, I am speaking of a source who is much closer to us in proximity. Ah, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. I am well aware that it was her favorite wish that her daughter and Mr. Darcy would be married. However, the two of them never took any of that seriously. Indeed, I observed Mr. Darcy and his cousin most carefully when they called on you earlier this week, and I detected no symptoms of affection on either of their parts toward each other. How I wish it were so simple as you suppose it to be, Charlotte said, which brings me to the subject of Lady Catherine's unexpected visit this morning. You see, even though she said you were engaged to be married to another, she was quite persuaded that your true purpose in being here was not to visit with me, but to set a trap for her nephew. I can only imagine how she will react when she learns that her greatest fear has unfolded. Charlotte, what are you saying? Do you agree with Lady Catherine that I came here with the sole purpose of trapping her nephew? Heavens, no! I only mean to say that Mr. Darcy will never fulfill her favorite wish and marry her daughter, that he will marry you instead. Oh. The two friends then embraced. At length Charlotte pulled away and asked, Where is Mr. Darcy now? He is at Rosings, no doubt having some version of this conversation with Lady Catherine as we speak. Chapter 32. The Same Mind. Darcy and Lady Catherine were together in the parlour at Rosings. Having bid her daughter Anne an early evening, her ladyship had her favourite nephew all to herself. As though seizing the chance to ascertain what he was about, she said, By Mrs. Jenkinson's account, you were most attentive to Mr. Collins's guest, Miss Elizabeth Bennet. I dare say you were overly attentive, to the exclusion of my Anne. I am also told that the young lady is very pretty. Darcy gave his aunt a somewhat disinterested look. He took a sip of his drink. He said nothing. Having spoken with his cousin at length 2 days ago, in order to dispel any expectation that she may have harbored for an alliance between them, he was pleasantly relieved to learn that she was of the same mind. If only Lady Catherine would speak with her own daughter, she would know her favorite wish will never unfold. Am I to believe that you and Miss Elizabeth have been observed walking about the lanes on this very day, no less? Your sources are not incorrect, Lady Catherine. Pray, how does it concern you how I choose to spend my time? Need I remind you that you are engaged to my daughter? That is, unless you plan to disregard the favorite wish of your mother, my dearly beloved sister, Lady Anne. Need I remind you that Anne and I are not engaged, nor will we ever be? I believe one should never say never. Who is to say which way the winds of fate may blow? In this case, I can, and I do say never, and in no uncertain terms. For you see, dear aunt, it is impossible that I might one day become engaged to your daughter. My heart belongs to another. What are you saying, nephew? I have given my heart and pledged my life to another. This is not to be borne. Who on earth is this young woman who dares to aspire to a position destined by birth for my Anne? Darcy finished his drink and placed his empty glass on a tray in exchange for a fresh beverage prepared for him by Lady Catherine's butler, who must have anticipated his need. He took a long swig, as well as ample time to savor its lingering effects. He eyed his aunt purposely. "Can you not guess?" A rambling rant that would not be easily repressed quickly ensued. This was the only way to describe Lady Catherine's fury as she paced the floor. "Have you taken complete leave of your senses, nephew? How dare you turn your back on your own family in this disgraceful manner? Have you no care for how such an alliance as you propose will be viewed by society? You will be a laughing-stock. And what of my daughter, Anne? Everyone who knows their family expects you to marry your cousin. It was the favorite wish of your mother as well as myself. How dare you subject your own flesh and blood to derision and possibly worse?" "I beg your pardon. I cannot speak for society in general, but anyone who knows me knows I never intended to marry Anne. And in view of the fact that I have told you as much every year since reaching the age of majority, I shall not apologize for what you perceive as an egregious offense." "How dare you speak to me in such an insolent manner? But then, what else should I expect, when you have rendered yourself so low that you do not see the foolishness in allying yourself with tradesmen? Have you no consideration whatsoever for your own family's noble lineage, our proud heritage? You are mistaken in suggesting that I have somehow lowered myself. Miss Elizabeth Bennet is a gentleman's daughter. I am a gentleman, just as my father was a gentleman. That makes the two of us equals." "Equals? What about her mother's father? What of her uncles, their father's father, and the fathers before them? Generations of lowly tradesmen that stretch so far back in time as to be considered disgraceful. Are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted? Have a care, Lady Catherine, if you wish to be received at Pemberley. You may not approve of my bride, but from this point on, I expect you to keep your low opinion of her to yourself." "And if I do not?" Lady Catherine demanded. "Then you shall consider all ties between the two of us as severed, for I will not have you disparage my bride or my bride's family. I am not used to having my opinion fashioned by others. I have always done as I please, when I please. I shall not argue with you, Lady Catherine. I have said all I have to say to you on this matter. Pardon me," Darcy said, heading for the door. "Where do you think you are going? I am not finished having my say on this matter." "Where do you think I am going?" "If you know what is best, you will stay here and listen to all I have to say." "Like you, I am not used to having my will subjugated by others, either. You have my final word on this matter. I shall not countenance dissenting opinions on how I ought to live my own life. As it appears you and I have reached an impasse, I shall take my leave of Rosings, with the intention of never returning so long as your opinion of my bride remains unchanged." After Darcy stormed out on his aunt, he went straight to the parsonage. He could not wait to tell his betrothed that he had informed Lady Catherine of their engagement, and to relay how seriously displeased she was as a result. When he was shown into the parlor, he was delighted to see that his newly betrothed was alone. Her amazing dark eyes were the perfect calm to the tumult in his mind brought on by his confrontation with Lady Catherine. "Mr. Darcy, this is a pleasant surprise," Elizabeth said smilingly, and then laying her pen aside. "I have interrupted your writing." "Indeed, I am writing a letter to Jane to share our happy news." Taking one of the chairs near hers, he drew it closer. "How would you like to tell your sister in person, face to face?" "Of course, I would like nothing better, but as I am not scheduled to see her again until I return to town for at least 2 weeks, I thought it best not to keep her in suspense." He threw a quick glance in the direction of the sofa, a possible seating arrangement much better suited to his purpose. Standing, he extended his hand to Elizabeth. "Come and sit with me, my love," said Darcy. Elizabeth did as he asked, and crossing the room hand in hand, they sat next to each other. "I came here to tell you that I have spoken with Lady Catherine. Needless to say, she did not suffer our happy news very well. She is livid, and if I know anything at all about my aunt, it is that she will make the remainder of your stay here with the Collinses unbearable. I mean to protect you from any such unpleasantness by taking you away from here as soon as can be." "I suppose you mean to take me to town to stay with my relations?" "Actually, I mean to take you to Hertfordshire, to Longbourn, so that I might speak with your father and ask for his blessing. Of course, we may call on your relations in town. Perhaps your sister might wish to travel with us to Longbourn as well." He placed his hand on her chin, lovingly. "What say you, my love? Will you allow me to take you away from here?" "I believe I am obliged to go where you go, am I not?" "You have a choice, always, to do what you believe is in your best interest." "Well, in such a case like this, I believe our interests are perfectly aligned." "I was hoping you would say that. May our interests always align with each other's so perfectly as this, for I cannot think of a more satisfying recipe for our future marital felicity." He leaned forward and kissed Elizabeth ever so softly on her lips. "I shall leave you now, but I shall return at dawn. That way you will have the chance to say a proper goodbye to your friend, Mrs. Collins. I shall also arrange for a female servant to accompany us to avoid the specter of impropriety." "I can hardly wait." Darcy smiled. "Until then, I will leave you with this." He kissed Elizabeth again, this time more lingeringly. "Until dawn, my love." Chapter 33. The Proper Time. It troubled Elizabeth more than a little that her dearest sister Jane would not be among the first to learn of her engagement to Mr. Darcy. As planned, Darcy and Elizabeth went to Cheapside to see her relations while they were in town, but they arrived to find that her aunt and uncle were not at home. Furthermore, the servant could not say with any specificity when they might be expected to return. However, as the children were all there, Elizabeth could only assume that her aunt and her sister must have gone shopping, and her uncle was at one of his warehouses. In due time, Elizabeth stood in the hallway at Longbourn, alone. Mr. Darcy had remained outside in the paddock, charging his man with overseeing the preparations for his stay at an inn in Meryton. Elizabeth's eager mamma raced to her side. "Oh, Lizzie, what is the meaning of this? You are not due to return from Kent for at least a fortnight. And pray, what on earth are you about, arriving from Kent with Mr. Darcy? You must tell me all about it. But first, you must hear what I am about to say. My child, you will be delighted to know your sister Jane arrived just this morning. Oh, Lizzie, I believe I shall go quite distracted, for you will never guess who accompanied my Jane. Why, it was Mr. Bingley. Indeed, he asked to speak with your father alone in the library the moment he entered the house." Any disappointment Elizabeth suffered while on her way to Longbourn from town was outweighed by the tremendous joy and excitement she felt upon entering the drawing-room and espying Jane. The reunion with the sisters was everything Elizabeth hoped it would be, and she could have no complaints whatsoever by the manner in which her mother and sisters received Mr. Darcy when at last he walked into the room and took his station by her side. As remarkable as it was to have returned to Longbourn in company with Mr. Darcy, it appeared her family was far more fascinated by Jane's earlier arrival with Mr. Bingley by her side. Elizabeth was slightly torn between taking her sister aside and familiarizing herself with all that had apparently occurred within a short span of time and staying by Mr. Darcy's side. She was so pleased to see her sister, but the thought of abandoning Mr. Darcy was somewhat untenable. She had spent so much time attempting to shield him from her family's antics in the past. She was not sure how he would bear being alone with her mother and her younger sisters while he waited for his turn to go to the library to speak with her father. But the question of Mr. Bingley's presence weighed heavily on Elizabeth's busy mind. Were she to judge by her sister's countenance, no doubt Mr. Bingley was in the other room asking Mr. Bennet for permission to marry his eldest daughter. Proper decorum prevented Jane from confirming what everyone in the room undoubtedly expected. How wonderful it would be for all her family when Mr. Bingley emerged from the library with a broad smile, too. The thought that this was indeed the day that her family had waited for so long occurred to Elizabeth. This is Jane's day, to bask in the joy and felicitations of being newly engaged. Do I dare risk taking away from such an auspicious occasion with an engagement announcement of my own? I do not know that I can. But will Mr. Darcy understand? Will he be agreeable to postponing our own joy for a couple of days? Dare I even ask? He escorted me here from Kent, after all. Surely, when all is calm, and the excitement of Jane being the next mistress of Netherville is settled, and my mother and, I dare say, even my father will want to know how it came to be that I left Kent earlier than originally planned, with Mr. Darcy no less. I must speak with Mr. Darcy alone. Why waste a minute of my time with needless worry when he will know exactly what to do? But first things first, I must wait to see if Mr. Bingley is indeed seeking my father's blessing, and then I will know what to do. She glanced at Mr. Darcy to ascertain how all the excitement in the room affected him. His countenance was unreadable. Is he bored? Is he anxious? Elizabeth really could not tell. Thoroughly understanding his temperament was something she would master, she supposed. When at last a servant brought in the tea things, much to Elizabeth's delight, Mr. Darcy took advantage of everyone's ensuing distraction to speak with her. In a voice meant only for Elizabeth, he said, "If I know you at all, you are most anxious to speak with your sister alone." Elizabeth nodded. "I am indeed, but I would not wish to leave you here on your own." Darcy said, "No, you need not concern yourself. I do not mind waiting here while the two of you excuse yourselves for a bit of privacy." "Are you certain, sir?" He nodded. "I am." "I promise I will not be away for long. I simply cannot bear the suspense of not knowing Mr. Bingley's purpose for being here. Although I do have a strong suspicion I know what the reason is already." "No doubt you are hoping your sister will confirm that which you already suspect, and you want to be the first to wish her joy." Elizabeth threw a quick glance over her shoulder. Seeing that no one was paying attention to the two of them, what with Jane being fussed over by her mother, Kitty and Lydia discussing secret affairs in the corner of the room, and Mary with her nose buried in a book, she eased a little closer beside her intended. "If what you suspect is true, I wonder if this is the proper time for you to speak to my father about our situation." "What are you saying, Elizabeth?" Darcy asked, his voice quiet yet teeming with alarm. She placed her hand on his hand, resting on the sofa. "I am only saying that perhaps we might postpone our announcement for a day or two, at the most, so that we do not take away from Jane's time as a new bride." "Elizabeth, surely you must know that I would do anything in the world for you. And if this is truly so important to you, then I will agree, but only for a day or two at the most. News travels fast. And who is to say that Lady Catherine, or even the Collinses, might not share the news before I have a chance to ask for your father's permission?" She bit her lower lip. "Your point is well taken, sir." In the next instance, Bingley emerged from the library. His happy smile spoke volumes. He went directly to Jane, without even a passing glance to his close friend, Mr. Darcy. He unceremoniously picked up Jane and spun her around. Mrs. Bennet's excitement she could not repress. "Thank heavens, we are saved," she said, her hands clasped over her bosom. "We are saved." When Bingley put Jane down, it was evident that he had espied his friend in the midst of his celebration. He went to Darcy, who was standing with his hand extended, and Jane hurried into Elizabeth's outstretched arms. "Darcy, old man, what on earth brings you to Hertfordshire? There will be time enough for talking about me. It appears you are the man of the hour. You have my warmest wishes, my friend." Elizabeth and Jane, having exchanged all the pleasantries the occasion afforded, quietly quit the room. "Dearest Jane, you cannot know how happy I am to see you this way. I always knew how much Mr. Bingley loved you, and now the whole world will know it too. Oh, Lizzie, I feel like I have been walking around with this happy smile pasted all over my face for the past few days, ever since Mr. Bingley asked me to be his wife, and I said yes." Jane covered her mouth with both hands, and still her smile would not be repressed, for her eyes beamed with happiness. "If about me," she said, "pray tell me that you have happy news of your own to share. It cannot be a coincidence that you arrived to Longbourn with Mr. Darcy. Pray tell me that the two of you have reached an understanding." Elizabeth could barely contain her smile. "Oh, Jane, we have more than reached an understanding." "Pray tell me everything." "Well, very soon after I arrived in Hunsford, Mr. Darcy called on me. You see, he was under the impression that I was engaged to Mr. Wickham." "Mr. Wickham? His proposal was meant to be a secret. Whatever would cause Mr. Darcy to suppose you were engaged?" "Oh, it is a long story, and one that I will tell you about in due time. Suffice it to say that once the confusion was resolved, Mr. Darcy and I had a long, heart-to-heart talk, and we discovered that we loved each other. Dearest Jane, Mr. Darcy asked me to be his wife, and I said yes. Lizzie, my dear, this is indeed a day for surprises. I am so happy for you. I always suspected you loved Mr. Darcy, and I could not be happier knowing that the two of you have committed to spending the rest of your lives together as one. Thank you, Jane. So, when will Mr. Darcy speak with Papa? Oh, wait, do you suppose the two of them are together as we speak? Our poor mother must be thoroughly distracted. I really do not know." "What do you mean you do not know?" "I spoke with Mr. Darcy about the timing of seeking Papa's blessings. This is your day, after all. I do not dare intrude upon your joy by announcing my own engagement. Oh, Lizzie, you must not weep. You are my favorite person in the world, not counting Mr. Bingley." Jane colored a little with her confession. Elizabeth understood her sister's sentiments perfectly well. "Of course, you are correct, not counting Mr. Bingley. What I am trying to say is that I would treasure this day even more, knowing that you and I are sharing such similar joys. Pray do not suspend your own pleasure because of your feelings of hampering mine." Upon returning to the drawing-room, Elizabeth was pleased to see that Mr. Darcy was still there, talking with his friend Bingley. Bingley rushed to Jane's side, and soon the two of them were the sole objects of all of Mrs. Bennet's, as well as the other girls' exaltations once more, which gave Elizabeth a chance to speak with Mr. Darcy discreetly. Her smile could hardly be repressed. "I spoke with Jane, and she insists that we do not delay our happiness to accommodate hers." "So, you are staying?" She shook her head. "You must go to my father." "Oh, pray you will do so now, while everyone is thoroughly distracted." He quit the room in an instant. During the ensuing passage of time, as pleased as Elizabeth was for her sister, and as much as she wanted to celebrate Jane's joy with all the others, she was clearly distracted, with an eager eye trained on the parlor door. When at last Darcy returned, he said to Elizabeth, "Go to your father. He wishes to speak with you in the library." She was gone directly, and arrived to see her father sitting in his chair looking concerned. "My dear Lizzie, pray come inside." The elderly patriarch beckoned. "Come inside." "Mr. Darcy said you wished to see me." "Have a seat, my child." Elizabeth did as she was told, more than a little concerned by her father's perturbed countenance. At length he said, "Lizzie, you cannot possibly imagine how shocked I was by Mr. Darcy's visit, for I have it on good authority that you are already on the verge of being engaged to Mr. Wickham." "No, Papa, there was never an engagement, not actually." "Is the gentleman aware of that?" "Well, in truth, he did offer his hand in marriage, but I never gave him a favorable reply." Mr. Bennet arched his brow. Regarding his daughter intently, he asked, "Would you say you gave him an unfavorable reply?" "No, I did not. I told Mr. Wickham that I needed time to decide." "And you ran off to Kent and decided to marry Mr. Darcy? Lizzie, are you certain you know what you are about?" "Are you saying that you denied Mr. Darcy's petition, that you did not give us your blessing?" "I have given him my consent. He is the kind of man, indeed, to whom I would never dare refuse anything which he condescended to ask. I now give it to you, if you are resolved on having him. That really is not the point." "What is the point?" Elizabeth inquired, "if I may ask." "I cannot help but feel that you use Lieutenant Wickham poorly, and for your own sake, I would like to know what you mean to do about it. How do you intend to explain any of this to Mr. Wickham? For surely it is the right thing to do." "I beg to differ, Papa, for I do not owe Lieutenant Wickham any such explanation for my decision to marry Mr. Darcy. Besides, my decision to accept Mr. Darcy's hand has nothing at all to do with my decision not to accept Lieutenant Wickham's proposal." "Are you quite certain the two events are not intricately connected to each other, my dear?" "Why would you even question me in that regard?" She arose from her chair and slowly drifted to the fireplace. Folding one arm over the other, she turned and faced her father. "What do you care about Lieutenant Wickham, Papa, if I may be allowed to ask?" "I only care about you, my child," said Mr. Bennet. "I fear that in choosing Mr. Darcy, a gentleman of untold wealth, over Lieutenant Wickham, who was once such a favorite of yours when you were last in Hertfordshire, that your motives may be mercenary. And if such is the case, I fear you are subjecting yourself to insufferable discontent. Need I remind you that the possession of a great fortune does not guarantee happiness? And I would not wish for you to enter into an alliance believing otherwise." "Papa, my desire to marry Mr. Darcy has nothing at all to do with the size of his fortune." "I pray you speak nothing but the truth, for I would not wish for you to enter into an engagement lightly and without good cause. It is true that your Mr. Darcy is a wealthy man. You will have such fine carriages and jewelry, a house in town, and everything that is good. But will that make you happy?" "In truth, Papa, I would wish to marry Mr. Darcy, even if he lacked the capability to provide any of the things you have described. I love him most ardently, and I know he feels the same way about me. I cannot say that about Lieutenant Wickham and me. And just as I did not wish to commit to marriage with a man whom I did not respect in the case of Mr. Collins, I also do not wish to commit to marriage with a man whom I do not love." "You really do love Mr. Darcy, then?" he said, as though the veracity of her claim finally rang through to him. She nodded. "I do." A tiny teardrop escaped her eye. "I really do." He stood from his chair and approached his favorite daughter with open arms. "Well, as that is the case, Mr. Darcy is not just a man blessed with everything the heart of mortal man can desire. He is also so very lucky to have you." He kissed his favorite daughter atop her head. "I could not have parted with you, my dearest Lizzie, to anyone less worthy." Mr. Bennet looked into Elizabeth's eyes. "This is a happy day indeed, and no doubt your mother will go completely distracted when she hears the news. Now, be a dear and close the door tightly when you leave. That is, unless some other young man is awaiting his turn to come into the library to ask for Mary, Kitty, or Lydia's hand, in which case please send them right in, for I am indeed of a mind to be quite accommodating." Epilogue. The picturesque summer day, the sisters' glorious double wedding ceremony, and finally, the wedding breakfast at Netherfield were perfect in every way. To think Elizabeth was so afraid that day would never come, and she would have had no one to blame but herself. She had admonished herself time and time again for what might have been had Mr. Darcy not intervened on her family's behalf. Standing by her husband's side, looking over the ballroom floor and watching her youngest sister partaking in the gaiety, Elizabeth said, "Allow me to thank you again and again for saving my sister Lydia from Wickham's wrath. She is my sister too, and although my sister Georgiana was spared, I would never have forgiven myself had a similar fate befallen Lydia." Elizabeth placed her hands on his. "I am mightily impressed that your sister had the courage to confide her unfortunate history with Mr. Wickham to me, and a little surprised that you never mentioned a word of it to me. It was not my story to tell, but your having heard it from Georgiana confirms my original supposition that the two of you shall be the closest of sisters, which is precisely as I had hoped it would be. Yes, I am so delighted to know that she will come to live with us at Pemberley after our wedding journey. I am sure I will be exceedingly happy there, and even more so now that I have the assurance that all my family is welcome to visit us, especially my aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. I think they like you very much. You made quite a favorable impression on them when you invited them to Darcy House for dinner, just as I knew you would." "I only aim to please you, my love." "And I you. We are truly blessed to have found each other. Still, I shudder to think what might have been had you not arrived in Brighton when you did, and in a manner not too dissimilar to your arrival in Ramsgate last year in time to thwart Wickham's attempt to elope with Georgiana. As do I, to be sure. In Lydia's case, he had hoped to exact a severe punishment against you for spurning his offer of marriage, Darcy opined." Elizabeth remembered the gentleman's harsh reaction all too well, for it was complete with accusations of being ill-used, not only by her, but by Darcy as well, and threats of retaliation when they least expected it. Darcy continued, in Georgiana's case, he had hoped to seize control of her dowry of £30,000. In either case, his revenge would truly have been complete. She nodded. "Indeed, against both of us." Darcy leaned down and brushed a kiss atop his bride's head. "Enough of such talk. This is our wedding day." With unpleasant thoughts of the chance meeting in London with his aunt, Lady Catherine, in the back of her mind, specifically how badly that had turned out, to say nothing of all the false approbation bestowed on her by Miss Bingley of late, Elizabeth readily acquiesced. Her personal philosophy immediately came to mind. Think only of the past as its remembrance gives you pleasure. Smiling happily, she said, "Agreed. We shall have nothing but happy thoughts from this moment forward." Darcy never thought that in traveling to Hertfordshire to be of service to his friend Charles Bingley and learning the ins and outs of managing a large estate, he would meet and fall deeply and irrevocably in love with the woman with whom he would spend the rest of his life. And yet, that is precisely what I have done, he considered, as he watched his wife sleeping peacefully beside him. A part of him, the stoic, fastidious side, that was a fierce proponent of proper etiquette and decorum, tugged at his consciousness for being in her bed at that hour of the morning. This was also the part of him that he was teaching himself to ignore more and more with each passing day. If given a choice, the two of them would never leave that room. But alas, even the master of Pemberley had not the benefit of such leisure. Any moment, Elizabeth would awaken, eager to commence her day as the mistress of her new home. How fortunate that my beautiful bride relishes this particular role as my wife with equal alacrity, he silently considered, as he envisioned just a few of the ways he might endeavor to keep her right there beside him for the next few hours or so. Allowing his mind to wander thusly, he imagined loosening her lush hair, which she had managed to braid into a long plait at some point during the night. And then he would comb his fingers through her dark tresses. If that did not awaken her, he would simply nibble on her earlobe, somewhat playfully, just the way she liked it, for that would surely stir her from her slumber. Next, he would trail kisses along her neckline, her shoulders, and eventually find his way to her ever so enticing lips. He could feel his ardor increasing with every review of the many times he had awakened her in that manner before. With a gentle thrust, he meant for his wife to feel it too. No longer satisfied with merely envisioning how it would be with his wife, Darcy set forth to bring it all about, starting with her hair and, as he had imagined it, her earlobes, her neckline. Much to his delight, she responded with an adorable glance over her shoulder. Just as quickly as that, she turned and, upon finding a comfortable spot, melded her body perfectly with his. His morning routine, which began the first day they awakened at his London townhouse as man and wife some months ago, now well underway. It pleased him immensely to be able to say that things just kept getting better. At length, their lovemaking having reached its crescendo, the two of them looked deeply into each other's eyes. "Good morning," he whispered. "Good morning indeed." Brushing her hair aside, he kissed her forehead. "And how did you sleep, Mrs. Darcy?" "Perfectly well during those times when I was permitted to do so. Not that I am complaining, mind you, my love." "Indeed, for even if you were to complain, I would hardly find your protests credible." Her spirits rising to playfulness, Elizabeth said, "You are very mischievous this morning." "Yes, and you love me even more because of it." She smiled, that exact same lovely smile that always took his breath away. "I really do. I believe I love you more and more each day." "May you always feel that way, my love." "So long as I am awakened each morning in such a manner as this, I believe I shall have no cause to feel otherwise." "Is that truly your wish? For surely you are aware of the adage, to be careful what you wish for." "I know it well," Elizabeth said, nestling more comfortably in his arms. "Well, in that case, I shall make it the business of my life to see to it that all of your wishes come true." You have been listening to Irrevocably Gone, written and read by P.O. Dixon, inspired by P.O. Dixon's best-selling short story, A Tender Moment. Thank you for listening to another of my author-read stories. Please note that the more likes and subscribes and comments, the more my channel grows, and the more professionally narrated stories I will be able to bring you. In the interim, I'm glad you're enjoying my author-read stories. Happy listening.